check it to make sure that are we live on the actual thing?
I don't see us yet.
Okay, it might be a little bit of a delay.
There we go.
Are we live? Okay. Sweet. At long last there. So just FYI for you guys who are listening to this, we are about 15 seconds behind or in front of you guys, so to speak. So we really appreciate you guys, all of you who are tuning in, so to speak. So hello and welcome to the NotACast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brendan P. Fish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 77th episode of the NotACast entitled The New Boss, an analysis of A Clash of Kings, Tyrion I, in which everyone's a gangsta until a gangsta walks into the room. Can I say gangsta? Is that all right for me to say, or do I have to say gangster?
I wrote it with the hard R's for a reason, Jeff, but you do you, buddy. You do you.
Oh, I always do. That's kind of the way that I roll these things, so to speak. So it's a lot of fun. So yeah, this chapter and Tyrion's chapters in A Clash of Kings we were talking about our pre-production is they're a whole lot of fun. And, it's one of those things that we have had a lot of fun reading about in a Game of Thrones. I think when we were doing our Patron only episode, I'll talk about this a little bit in the regular cast, that they were my favorite chapters from A Clash of Kings, or from a Game of Thrones rather. Those late Tyrion chapters 7, 8, and 9 were really spectacular, I thought. And I think we're just continuing in that good vein here in A Clash of Kings.
Oh yeah, Tyrion really ramps up in Clash. Arya, as we said when we're doing the Arya 1 through 3 episode, gets twice as many chapters and clearly a lot of attention focused on her. But even more so, you can see George zeroing in on Tyrion's character and what he wants to do with Tyrion. In the first book, as fun as his chapters were, they weren't hugely plot relevant, or they were, but he himself wasn't hugely plot relevant. You know what I mean? He was just kind of wandering around the edges of things, being like the jester character, poking fun at stuff. Now he's the center. And it's such a different ballgame with Tyrion as the protagonist versus Ned, as we'll get into in the episode proper.
Absolutely. It's going to be a lot of fun to get into Tyrion as the protag for Clash of Kings, just as Ned was for a Game of Thrones. And if you guys are listening in on the live stream portion of the episode, again, we are a few seconds behind you guys. I think we were planning to do a little bit of Q&A before we actually get into the main episode itself. So if you guys got questions or things you want to chat about, let us know. We'll take a look at the comments as we're going through the episode itself, and we'll kind of circle back after we do kind of this intro stuff. But before we go any further, this episode, as always, is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King, Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Mark N., Lord Travis, Master of Ships and War of the Waves, Sir Keith J., Master of Whisperers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Jancy O., Lady Commander of the Night's Watch, Lord Jean, Master of Coin, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Red Woman and Mistress of Whisperers, Lord Baby the Onion Baby, Lord Blackheart the Defiant, Master of Zorse, Lord Micah, Warden of the West and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High-Bearded Priest, the Blue-Ringed Octoling, Lord Jake, Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Zena Valerian, Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Frank B., Lord James Stormborn, War of the Worldwide Werewood. Again, that is such a mouthful. Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Richard, Sea Lord Brabus, and we have a brand new member of the small council, but they would prefer to remain anonymous, so thank you, Anonymous, for joining up with us. We know who you are, even if the world doesn't, and you have that preference, and that is totally fine with us.
What could be more honorable than that? So welcome and thank you so much to the anonymous member of the small council, and thank you as always to all our previous members.
Absolutely. Our spoiler is to talk about in all episodes. We'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan Lake novellas, histories, interviews, the Windsor sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Let me just put a couple of questions we're getting from the YouTube in. Okay. Perfect. Our question this week comes from Lady Hannaby, a Sworn Sword patron, who asks, "Hi guys, new patron here after being super impressed by your work analyzing the climax of A Game of Thrones. Thank you so much. I have just completed a reread, a re-listen to all 5 books." There you go, Jeff, someone else who can't read.
That's right.
And going through each book one after the other made me realize that while there is a consistent tone and shared ideas, certain themes are more prominent in some books than others. For instance, I feel like A Clash of Kings really deals strongly with leadership, and A Feast for Crows engages with religion/faith more than any other book to date. So my question, what would you say are the most distinct defining themes for each book? Well, thank you, Lady Hannah, for your support, and thank you so much for that question. That's a really great, interesting question, I think. I'll just run through it, I think, real quick before I turn it over to Jeff. A Game of Thrones, as I said, kind of ad nauseum while we were covering it, I think is about the fall from grace and losing your innocence. That's what happens to Bran with his fall, happens to Sansa with all her dreams and stories and songs. Happens to Jon at the Wall. It even happens to Ned. I mean, he's older than all those other characters, but he gets disillusioned regarding Robert specifically and the life they live together. Clash of Kings, as Hannah says, is a lot about leadership and focusing on different leadership styles. But I think specifically, as we got into in Sansa 1 and we're going to get into in this chapter, I think Clash of Kings is about how is it that Joffrey, this manifestly unfit, spoiled, sadistic child, is king at the beginning of the book and king at the end of the book. How does that happen? How does everyone make these mistakes and errors in judgment to result in that process? And I think the book explores that at length. I think Storm of Swords, in the wake of like all the problems that come up in the first 2 books, is about attempts to solve the problem. For good or ill. I mean, that's how Tywin frames the Red Wedding, right? That's going to solve the war. Now, he's full of shit, as we've said before, and we'll get into at length in the Storm of Swords, but it's just one of many examples. Dany's Dracarys, Beric knighting a bunch of people and saying all the sides are a problem. We're going to fight all of them at once. Stannis saying, I'm going to burn Edric Storm to save the world, and then I'm going to go north to save the world. All these attempts at cutting through the Gordian knot and solving the problem. A Feast for Crows, as Hannah says, is more focused on religion and faith than many of the other books, but I think Feast, even though it's less propulsive in terms of momentum than the rest of the books and doesn't have a lot of main characters in it, I think it's the most interesting in terms of themes. And I would say what it's about is you have all these major characters who died in the Storm of Swords, and Feast for Crows opens up like Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy just died, Dorne, Oberyn Martell just died, King's Landing, Tywin just died, and you have these opportunities in the wake of the deaths of these powerful people to improve and reshape your societies for the better. And all those opportunities get squandered. Like that's, for me, that's the point of the Feast for Crows. Sometimes, again, for sympathetic reasons. Like I get why Doran Martell is not moving on from his vengeance, given what happened to his family. Sometimes it's less sympathetic, like when the Ironborn elect Euron. But like you get to like Jaime's last chapter near the very end of the book, and like he's tried to set the Riverlands to rights, and it's just blatantly not working, trying as hard as he can, but everyone's still pissed at each other and ready to start fighting as soon as he turns his back. And then the snow starts falling, and it's winter, and he thinks to himself, I wonder how my father's going to feed the country. And then he remembered that his father was dead. And it's like, that's perfect. That sums up A Feast for Crows to me. And then A Dance with Dragons, the objectively best book in the series, of course, I think has a lot in common with the universally beloved Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi, in that it's about failure. It's about like what you do when you're trying to fulfill a hero archetype and you fall short for, again, sympathetic reasons or not. Quentin is the obvious case, but also Jon trying to be Lord Commander and realizing at the end, fuck it, I can't do this. I can't reconcile these identities. Dany walking away from Meereen because she's like, this is not my home. I can't make peace with the peace I've made, so to speak. You have all these different characters who are trying to live up to this role, and then by the end of the book, they're all kind of falling short. And then the book ends with Varys giving this big monologue about how young Griff is going to be the one to fulfill that hero archetype. And I think the reader, having just seen Quentin and Jon and Dany, is supposed to go, I don't think so, Varys. Yeah. I don't think it's going to work out quite the way you think. So that's part of what makes Dance really interesting for me. So I've ranted enough, sir. What do you think are the big kind of thematic thrusts of each book in the series?
Well, as always, I feel like you like say it before I could even like, get around to it. I mean, like
I try.
You have it all the way in on the book, so to speak. So, I mean, broadly speaking, I think like Game of Thrones is very much focused on the question of leadership. I want to say for like character like Ned Stark, Catelyn Stark, Robb Stark, Joffrey Baratheon, Lannister, all those characters, Jon as well. Yeah, I think like we're also getting a lot of foundation for different characters too for their future leadership arcs, whether it's going to be Jon Snow or Sansa Stark, Arya Stark in a little bit of a different context. I think and then that spills into a Clash of Kings where a lot of those kid characters are still on kind of a leadership developmental arc. I think when you look at like Bran's perspective in the Clash of Kings, he's very much in this weird position of being technically in charge of things in the North, but not really being in charge of things in the North because he's got Maester Luwin and Roger Cassell who are actually running things in King's Landing. But then you actually have legitimate leaders too in King's Landing, and rather in Westeros, such as Tyrion Lannister, our character who we are going to be chatting about here in a little bit. And he has a very interesting dynamic in terms of power. And that's going to be one of the things that's going to anchor the end of this episode itself. Not just anchor the end of this episode, but anchor the end of the chapters, that riddle that Varys poses to Tyrion about who lives and who dies when you have the sellsword.
Tell your story. You couldn't help it.
No, that's good. That's good. So you're allowed to sing now? Is that what you're saying? So you're allowed to sing now? Is that what we're going with now?
Yeah, the rules aren't fair, Jeff. They're just the rules. Got to deal with it.
It's so unfair. God, you're just like the worst dad ever. Okay, so I think Storm Swords, like broadly speaking, I think we see people coming into their power. Jon Snow becomes Lord Commander at the end of the book. Robb Stark falls from power. The Lannisters emerge triumphant, but then they also fall very quickly with the death of Tywin Lannister. I think
Sure.
we see, I think I want to say like Storm of Swords almost, if you want to talk about like the theme of it specifically, I almost would say for the Lannisters, the theme is hubris. Like you think that
Yeah.
you're like on the top of your game, and then when you get all the way to the end of the book, you're actually just sitting, you're actually shitting yourself as you die. Like that's essentially the thematic point of A Storm of Swords for the Lannisters. For the Starks, it's like being reduced to a very low level, but still having hope at the end of the story for Sansa going up to the Vale and having
Yeah.
some semblance of power in the form of Littlefinger, and the death of Lysa Arryn, Arya Stark leaving Westeros as well, Jon Snow again becoming Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. So I think we have a lot of interesting themes for the first 3 books. I think books 4 and 5 are really where George actually sits down and starts to really think about the series. And I don't think this is all the reason why those books took so long to write, but I do think that part of the reason why they did take a long time was because that George actually not reevaluated the series, but gave it a lot more thought than he was used to, such as, A Feast for Crows is obviously talking about what the hubris of the Lannisters leads to. It's A Feast for Crows is what victory looks like for the Lannisters. Dance, I think, does a lot of interior work in terms of the characters, Dany, Jon, and Tyrion in particular, but also the other characters too. I love your point you're making about young Griff and about the question of who is the hero, right? Is it going to be Quentyn Martell? Is it going to be young Griff? Or is it going to be the characters we've established? We've had those kind of leadership development arcs going through the first 3 books, Dany, Jon, and Tyrion's been in power, but Dany and Jon particularly, and Sansa and Arya too. So I think those are some of the 3. So those are the major themes that I see in the books as well. I think that they don't. I think that George has talked about how he likes to have multiple themes going on in the story at the same time. I think he said that actually recently at Worldcon. So having that idea in mind, it's hard to like pick just one for each of the books, but I think it's a good. It's a good exercise to kind of think about the books and what's the message of each individual book. But at the same time, I do think there are multiple things going into the story at the same time.
Well said, sir. Yeah, it's not so much that we're tunneling down to the one theme that defines each book, but thinking about which theme defines each book gets you closer to what that book is about and gets you thinking about how it's distinct from the other books. And I think for me, what really brought me to A Feast for Crows, which, as I said, is a pretty slow book, unlocking a lot of the main characters, is zeroing in on what it was about and what it was trying to say. And I found that to be more interesting than some of the stuff in the first 3 books. So thank you so much to Hannah for the question. If you want to ask us a question, you can go ahead over to patreon.com/NotACast ASOIAF. Anyone who contributes $10 or more a month gets to ask us questions to be done at the beginning of each episode. Speaking of our Patreon, since we hit our $5,000 a month stretch goal, we're going to be doing episodes on Fever Dream, George R. R. Martin's 1982 vampire novel. Our kind of intro episode on that, which is just one of our patron monthly episodes, but we're just laying down kind of the foundation for where we're going to go with the Fever Dream episodes proper. That episode is now out for small council patrons as we're recording. It'll be out for all $5 and above patrons by the time this episode begins to air, though. So if you're one of our patrons, enjoy that. That'll just a little taste of where we're going to go with Fever Dream.
Yeah, so Fever Dream is a really fun book. If you guys have never read it before, I highly recommend you guys do read it. And if you don't read, we've got a lot of comments in our live stream about people who are just listening to audiobooks. As a little plug for Fever Dream and George R. R. Martin, I'm expecting royalties for me saying this. If you purchase the audiobook through Audible or one other or whatever service you use, the narrator for the book is Ron Donachie, who is Sir Roderick Cassell from Game of Thrones, and he is also the father of Daniel Portman, who is Sir Podrick Payne in the books as well. And he does a fantastic job of narrating the books. So go ahead and check that out. Use your Audible credit for this month to look at Fever Dream because it's awesome. Our first episode is pretty short, but I think it's about 40 minutes, so to speak, but it's mostly just introducing the book and also having you guys lightly spoilers, so as to prevent like major spoilers for you guys who are reading it for the first time to kind of get, not too spoiled about it, but it's a lot of fun. It's a really great book, and we really are excited to be diving into it.
For sure, it's going to be terrific. We've only just begun. It's only going to get better from here. And that was part of our previous stretch goal, and we've announced our new Patreon stretch goal. This one is about not how many dollars we're pulling in a month, but the number of patrons. Once we hit 1,000 patrons, we're going to do an episode all about my very favorite chapter in A Song of Ice and Fire, even though it technically hasn't been released yet. And that is The Forsaken, Aeron Dampire's first chapter from the Winds of Winter, a mind-blowing slab of cosmic horror that lays out what Euron Greyjoy is up to, but also introduces a bunch more mysteries. So once we hit 1,000 patrons, we're going to do a big old episode around that. I might even let Jeff talk in it if he's good.
I can talk in this episode. We've already, so we were, so kind of one of the things, so you guys who are watching this, this past weekend, I actually got to hang out, not this past weekend, the past week, I got to hang out with Emmett in New York City as he is right now. And we were sitting at a bar having a drink. And one of the things that says, Emmett, I've got this great idea for the bad, stupid, ugly theory for when we get, if and when we get to that Patreon level of 1,000 pages a month. So I'm not going to spoil it here, but it is something that I previously believed in. That's going to be our bad, stupid, ugly theory. That's the only time I'm going to be able to talk in that episode, I think.
I'll permit you to have that part of the episode to yourself. If you want to jump in and say you were wrong, I will not stop you. I got to get it now because I've become, as I've been saying, I'm becoming more and more convinced by your Barristan theory. So I gotta like hedge my bets in terms of being nice to you when you're wrong about things, because I'm getting the feeling I'm going to be wrong about that one. But that'll be an episode in itself.
It shall be. Yeah, we did get a suggestion for a Patreon episode, which I think we will pursue someday down the road, but I will not talk about it right here because I like to keep those things surprises down the road.
Absolutely.
So I think we got some questions from our YouTube live streamers, and this will not be in the regular cast itself. So this is a little treat for you guys who are watching. We really appreciate it for all the questions you guys have submitted to us. And as I'm looking right now, it says we have 73 people watching, which is really cool, really, really awesome.
Yeah. How we doing, everybody?
And the first question we got from Mubarak M, who asks, who was the worst written character in the series, major and minor? So Emmett, who is the worst written character in the series?
If you count Jorah Mormont as major, which I think you have to do because he's one of the more prominent non-point of view characters, he's my pick because he just never develops. And I don't think he adds much to Dany's story. I think he's a real missed opportunity for Tyrion's story. Maybe they'll bond and bring something out of each other in the Winds of Winter, but he's got the same motives he always did. He's just kind of crappy and pathetic in the same way he's always been. And I compare him to other major non-point of view characters like Sandor or Stannis that are just like so psychologically fascinating and really do develop even though you're not in their heads. Or even Varys, like I think is a more compelling character on the whole than Jorah. So I'm glad the show casts someone compelling because overall Jorah becomes more enjoyable on the show just for that reason. Minor characters, Simon Silvertongue is not especially compelling. I get why he's there. He's there, like the fact that Tyrion has him killed is, I think, an important signpost for Tyrion in terms of the darkness he's getting into, as we'll discuss with Shay in this episode in a little bit. But like as a presence himself, he's just kind of annoying and pathetic and doesn't really go anywhere. I like kind of the Tyrion chapters early on in Storm don't really have much momentum because that's the one part of the series in which the main player in King's Landing is a non-POV Tywin. So we kind of just are on the outside of it. So I think those would be my choices, Jorah and Simon Silvertongue. What about you?
So it's interesting. I think like I almost want to say that Jorah's not minor. He's secondary. I don't know. Maybe he's major. I like that though. I think that Jorah doesn't do really anything for the narrative that we don't get from other characters. I think like he could have been more interesting in A Dance with Dragons and more introspective too about like his perspective being enslaved and being a former slaver and the kind of that having reversal going on, but it just doesn't. George doesn't explore that as much because most of the time when Jorah's a slave, he's pretty quiet until he actually draws the sword and kills that one youngish lord in the Winds of Winter. I think for me, like a major character that I think is like the worst written character. I have a hard time with this. So the obvious answer is Aerys Oakheart, right? In terms of point of view characters, just because he could have been done by Aaron Martell, but I'm going to defend Aerys Oakheart as a point of view when we get to him in A Feast for Crows a little bit, not too much, not too much. But I do think he doesn't really add a whole lot to the story, but I do think that it's good that he's there to provide a certain type of perspective for Dorne. In terms of minor characters, what about Quaithe? I'm surprised you didn't say Quaithe. Is she a minor character or a major character?
We've already ragged on Quaithe plenty. Plus, she's not even a character. She's just an archetype. She's just an info dump. But you know, again, we'll. I don't want to run out of all my problems with Quaithe before we actually get to her in this book. So I'll reserve my scorn for the moment.
Indeed. All right. So thank you, Mubarak M, for the question. Our next one comes from Samir K, who asks best and worst pets in A Song of Ice and Fire. Drogon being the worst because he kills the child in A Dance with Dragons. I think that's the worst pet, right?
Yeah, I think the dragons as a whole, I would say, are not the best ones. Best I think has to be Tommen's cats, right? Those
Ghost. Come on.
No, why? Because what? What does Ghost do?
Ghost provides John the ability to survive after life, dude. That's the reason why he's in the story. He's the ghost. He's going to be
He hasn't
John's
technically
ghost.
done that yet.
Not technically yet, but actually, technically, I would say he has, because that's John's final word is ghost when he's being stabbed in John's final chapter.
That's fair. I don't know how much credit I'm giving Ghost for that one. I don't think Ghost is making the call there. I think imagine Ghost's reaction when John shows up in his brain. What? That's going to be fun. Yeah, I mean, the direwolves, I like the direwolves just fine. I feel like they may have been more prominent in George's early conception of the series than they actually are now. But, we'll see what happens with Nymeria, because that could prove me wrong in that regard. But, I'm more a cat person than a dog person. So I guess I got to go Sir Pounce with that one.
Mm-hmm. Our next question says, thank you, Samir K, for the question. Our next question comes from one of our high ladies, Lady Maddie W. Actually, don't remember your exact title. You did give me one on Patreon, but I forgot to read it before we came on here. And she asks, in which book do you like Tyrion the most? So this is a great question for you, because you've written a ton about Tyrion Lannister, Tyrion of House Lannister, so to speak.
Yeah, I wrote a ton about his arc in Dance, because I think it's underappreciated, and I think works really well in context with his previous arc. So Dance is where I like Tyrion most as a character. In terms of where I like most enjoy him as a person, it's got to be Clash, because this is where he's at his kind of his most powerful, and he's trying to do things. Whereas again, in Game, he's just kind of wandering around. In Storm, he's just kind of fuming, and in Dance, he just hates everything. So yeah, Tyrion in Clash is the version of Tyrion I would most want to be around. But Tyrion in Dance, I think, is the most compelling as a character.
I want to say like Tyrion in the Game of Thrones almost is like the most I would want to be around, like from like Tyrion 1 from a Game of Thrones, Tyrion 2.
Library Tyrion. That's
before he goes up to the Vale, before he's at the end of the crossroads, I think that's the version of Tyrion that I would most like to be with. Yeah. I think like the best written though is Tyrion from A Dance of Dragons. I mean, I think there's few better arcs in the books. I think John's in A Dance of Dragons, maybe Dany in A Dance of Dragons, but I think Tyrion's is pretty pivotal and vital and some of George's best work. I think part of the reason why it's some of George's best work is because he essentially rewrites the character from the character we've known and loved from Game to Clash to A Storm of Swords, and makes him a much more darker character and interesting in such a way that it's real believable that he would take this super villainous turn at the start of A Dance of Dragons and really kind of continuing through A Dance of Dragons. It's not like he like makes a major like move upwards until of course he meets Penny, but Penny's gonna die, of course.
And that's not even a move upwards. Penny, I mean, I love Penny, and she's done nothing wrong, but she makes it worse for Tyrion, because now Tyrion has to deal with another dwarf who actually is happy and optimistic, which makes Tyrion just go, oh, so that's a choice I could make. Screw that. I don't want to have to think about that it's a choice I'm making.
Right.
So yeah, I agree. I think that's really when you see who Tyrion is, and I think it was a real risk on George's part to write Tyrion that way, and I think it paid off, although I know not everyone feels that way.
Agreed there. And Maddie did tell us that her title is Justiciar of the Trident. So thank you, Maddie. Justiciar of the Trident's a great title. We love it a lot and love all the titles you guys, as our small counselors and our high lords and ladies choose. That they're really, really cool. Our final question comes from and again, another title that I don't remember. Sir K.W. Dent, who is our friend in quotation marks. Kyle.
Wow.
In which he says,
just because he has bigger biceps than you doesn't mean you have to be mean to him, Jeff.
Well, okay, fine. I feel called out, and you're right.
Did I say that out loud? I thought I was thinking that.
Kyle does have bigger biceps than me, and it makes me very sad on the inside.
There we go.
Very, very sad. Okay, so he says, something I noticed at this time around was an increased quality in writing come feast. Not that Storm isn't good. Would you guys agree or not regarding prose post Storm of Swords?
That's interesting. Overall I agree. I think there's like you get to like the later Brienne chapters in Feast, I think are written just tremendously well in a way that's above and beyond the first 3 books. Bran's chapters in Dance for me are like the definition of spooky, psychedelic, high fantasy. I don't think it's ever been done better. But I think there are also moments when you can tell that he was kind of rushing to be done, or just kind of sick of putting these particular books together, where it felt like they could have used a little bit of a rewrite, like some of Eris Oakhart's stuff in the sex scene with Ariane. There are certain Dany lines in Dance that feels like, you could have phrased that a little better. So on the whole, I agree. But I think, as we've said before, the writing process of Feast and Dance was just a torturous slog, and that did have a toll.
I think it had a toll too. I think like the prose in some places is a lot better in Feast and Dance. I think I think like the John Connington chapters are really, really well written, like the
Oh
Lost
yeah.
Sword and the Griffin Reborn. Like the poetry that George uses for those chapters are just phenomenal. I think like there are parts like that Danny 3 where she's talking about their arousal was arousing, where you're like, George, come on, man. Like you could do a little bit better at that. That one could have been saved in the audio edit, but of course it wasn't. And but yes, I think like it's a little bit better post Storm of Swords, but I think there's also some great stuff pre Storm of Swords. Like if you think about,
of course,
like the Tower of Joy, I think is just one of the most phenomenal passages in modern literature in the past 30 years. I think that George wrote, I think that's really, really fantastic. And the poetry and beautiful scene setting that George does is just phenomenal. And I love it so much.
Oh, sure. That's one of those scenes that transcends the medium. It feels like a short film or like a Neil Young song or something. It just resonates, as we discussed with Chloe. Actually, we had a real fun episode on Eddard 10 with that. So yeah, I mean, obviously the whole series is well written, but yeah, Feast and Dance do have a particular depth and melancholia to them that I really take to, and I think makes those books above and beyond.
Absolutely. And Rob S. also in the chat brings up that the Asha chapter, Deepwood, may be some of George's best writing too.
Oh, hell yeah. Wayward Bride. Like that chapter is a book unto itself. Like one of George's better sex scenes. Again, really good, like impressive, emotional stuff. Great imagery, great battle scene, great ending when Asha like just sees Stannis's banners just like filtering through the woods at her. Amazing shit.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for the questions. We will sit around and bullshit with you guys after we do the main episode itself, as we always do for these live casts. And really, so many of you guys in the chat themselves, you guys are patrons, and you actually got us to the point where we're doing these monthly live streams, and that's really awesome on your guys' part that you got us this level. It's really cool. I think I feel like I don't thank you guys enough, because you guys really are making this podcast a reality, something that I love to do, and it's fun that you guys love it too. And I love doing it with you, man, of course, as always.
Oh, he feels things. I completely agree, Jeff. You make this great, and they make it greater.
Absolutely. So without further ado, this is a Tyrion chapter. So we are going to get into the synopsis for this chapter itself, get into the depth and everything like that. And then we're on into some foreshadowing groundwork and some main theorizing, everything like that. So here is the synopsis for A Clash of Kings, Tyrion I. Bouncer Sir Mandon Moore, described as, quote, a corpse in a shroud, stands in front of Tyrion like an off-duty cop outside of a Baltimore bar saying, I can't go in, which is fucking bullshit because my name is totally John Doe, born June 9th, 1969. Tyrion protests that he's got a letter from Tywin, the fucking hand of the king, but Mandon Moore repeats slowly to Tyrion, as if he's an idiot, that Cersei doesn't want to be disturbed. Jaime had once told Tyrion that Moore was the most dangerous of the Kingsguard, excepting himself always, because his face gave no hint as to what he might do next. Tyrion, though, wants to know what Moore is thinking now, and sure, he could have Mandon Moore killed, but he'd rather not. It's his first day on the job. I think Mandon Moore has a different take vis-a-vis Tyrion on this, though, as we'll discuss later in A Clash of Kings. Guess we'll have to find that one out. Still, if he does nothing, Tyrion will be shown up as a hollow suit. So he decides on a threat. He asks Mandon if he knew Ser Varys Egan, which he did. Well, this guy, he points to Bronn, he fucking killed him. Mandon Moore makes no response for a while, and then he stands aside. But only Tyrion can enter. A small victory, Tyrion thought, but sweet. Tyrion thinks he's passed his first test as he enters the chambers, and inside are 5 members of the small council. They all stop talking when Tyrion walks in. You, his sister said in a tone that was equal parts disbelief and distaste. I can see where Joffrey learned his courtesies. Cersei asks Tyrion why he's here, and Mailman Tyrion says he's only here to deliver a letter from Tywin. Only that. Varys takes the letter and declares it genuine, leading to Cersei snapping the letter from Varys' hand. She reads, and Tyrion notices that she's sitting in the king's seat. Tyrion judges that Joffrey did not attend council business, much like his father, so Tyrion takes the hand seat. This is absurd, the queen said at last. My lord father has sent my brother to sit in his place in the council. He bids us accept Tyrion's hand of the king until such a time as he himself can join us. Pycelle, a moron, says they should welcome Tyrion. Janos Slynt, another moron, agrees. Besides, it's a damn dirty town and they need Tyrion to help clean the city up. Cersei says, yeah, wonder why that is. Aren't you the fucking cops or something, Janos? As for Tyrion, he should be out on the battlefield doing worship. Oh no, Tyrion's done with battles. Okay, Tyrion. But all the worship was charming compared to the Vale of Arryn. Littlefinger laughed. Well said, Lannister, a man after my own heart. Tyrion smiled at him, remembering a certain dagger with a dragonbone hilt and a Valyrian steel blade. We must have a talk about that, and soon. He wondered if Lord Peter would find that subject amusing as well. Tyrion then asks to be put to work and that he'll be a good servant. Cersei asked Tyrion whether he brought any of them sword fighting bros with him, and yes, Tyrion did. A few hundred anyways. Well, that's going to do fuck all once Renly or Stannis come to the city. And according to Cersei, it's goddamn rude for Tywin to send you in his place without Joffrey's consent. Well, take that up with him, Cersei, Tyrion so replies. He's at Harrenhal with an army. But regardless, Tyrion wants a private word with his sister. So each of the counselors gets to their feet. Varys is doing that weird obsequious shit he loves to do. Janos, who, by the way, Jon Snow will be headed to Dance with Dragons, also leaves. Pycelle gets up ponderously. Littlefinger strides over and wonders whether Tyrion wants Chambers and Maegor's holdfast. Oh, no. Tyrion wants the Tower of the Hand. You're a braver man than me, Lannister. You do know the fate of our last two hands. And just pause here. Like, what the fuck, Littlefinger? I mean, everyone seems to think Cersei had Jon Arryn killed, when in fact, it was you who killed Jon Arryn along with Lysa Arryn. So what are you doing, you moron? Regardless, Tyrion says it's not two hands, it's the last four hands of the king. Sure, Ned Stark and Jon Arryn, but also the pyromancer hand died during the sack quite mysteriously, and who could have possibly killed him? Then there was the other one that Aerys burned, and two more before them that died in exile and will have no further impact on the story. Fascinating, said Littlefinger, and all the more reason I'd sooner bed down in the dungeons. Perhaps you will get that wish, Tyrion. Tyrion thought, but he said, courage and folly are cousins, or so I've heard. Whatever curse may linger over the Tower of the Hand, I pray I'm small enough to escape its notice. Janos laughs, Creeperfinger smiles, and Pycelle bows. Alone now with Cersei, the two siblings, or cousins, it's still up for debate, who get along so well, begin immediately bickering. Cersei is annoyed by Tyrion's history lesson. Tyrion tries joking around. Cersei is then annoyed by her father's letter, again asking why Tywin wanted to inflict Tyrion on her. He should have come himself. Cersei had commanded it through Joffrey. And he ignored you, Tyrion pointed out. He has quite a large army. He can do that. Nor is he the first, is he? Cersei threatens to call the letter a forgery and toss Tyrion to a dungeon, and Tyrion realizes that he's in a bit of a precarious position. He says that no one would care if he got tossed to the dungeon, especially Tywin. But really, Cersei, why would you want to do that? Tyrion is only here to help. Well, Cersei doesn't need his help. She required Tywin, but she wants Jaime, Tyrion points out. His sister fancied herself subtle, but he had grown up around her. He could read her face like one of his favorite books, and what he read now was rage and fear and despair. Tyrion says he'll free Jaime, and Cersei asks how, so Tyrion says he'll trade the Stark girls for him. Girl, Cersei corrects. They only have Sansa. The other one got away when Syrio, a hero, got in Meryn Trant's way. Cersei thinks that she's dead, which, so sad to say, Cersei, you're so fucking wrong. Tyrion was hoping for both Stark girls, but one would do. Tell me about our friends on the council. Cersei looks at the door and asks what about them. So Tyrion recounts how Tywin doesn't like them and wants their heads if they're disloyal. Cersei asks what Tywin knows, and Tyrion states that Tywin knows nothing. He suspects, rather. And why does Tywin suspect? Good question. He knows that your son's reign has been a long parade of follies and disasters. That suggests that someone is giving Joffrey some very bad counsel. I wonder who this individual could possibly be. Littlefinger. But according to Cersei, no one is giving him bad counsel. Joffrey has only received the best counsel. He's just so goddamn hard-headed. Sure. So Tyrion asks what the fuck happened with Ned Stark, and Cersei does her grimacing act, recounting how everything had been worked out, but then suddenly, Joffrey decided to give the crowd a show. And my God, the projection is so strong here, and I never saw it before reading this chapter again. All the same, the High Septon thinks that they profaned the Sept of Baelor, which, yeah, y'all have done fucked up that one. Can't imagine that one having any consequences down the road. Come a feast for crows. Then Tyrion asks after Harrenhal and why Janos Slynt, some goddamn commoner, was given the castle, and Cersei reports that Littlefinger made the arrangements. And did you know that Ned Stark had tried to name Stannis as rightful heir to Robert? The nerve! Thankfully, Sansa had told Cersei of the timing of Ned's plans. This kind of surprises Tyrion, but Cersei, ever the lady, says that Sansa was, quote, wet with love. Lovely. She would have done anything for that little shit. Okay, all well and good. Well, not really, but let's move on for now. What about Sir Barristan? How could Cersei have let that happen? Well, that bit of work came via Varys, as Joffrey wanted someone to blame, and Varys suggested Sir Grandfather. It worked out well. Jaime is now LC of the Kingsguard. So too, Sandor Clegane is now a part of the Kingsguard. Besides, they had even offered Barristan some lands, and he rejected it. The nerve of him. Sir Barristan was the Lord Commander of Robert Baratheon's Kingsguard, Tyrion reminded Cersei pointedly. He and Jaime are the only survivors of Aerys Targaryen's 7. The small folk talk of him in the same way they talk of Serban the Mirror Shield and Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight. What do you imagine they'll think when they see Barristan the Bold riding beside Robb Stark? Or Stannis Baratheon? I can't do the Stannis thing. Well, Cersei hadn't thought of that. Tyrion states that Tywin thought of that, and that's why Tyrion is here, to bring Joffrey to heel. Good fucking luck at that, Cersei sort of says. But Tyrion says he has the power to actually threaten Joffrey with harm. Cersei's eyes narrowed. If you believe I would ever let you harm my son, you're sick with fever. Tyrion sighs and thinks that Cersei is missing the point, as she always does. He tells her that Joffrey needs to feel insecure, but he'll be so safe with Tyrion. Besides, Joffrey needs Tyrion in order to stay seated on the Iron Throne. Tyrion reaches out and touches Cersei's hand. Odd. Because then Cersei is shocked that Tyrion would touch her and tells Tyrion that she'll only let Tyrion stay on as hand if he's her hand, and that he has some plans to share with, and that if he has some plans, he has to share them with Cersei at all times. Tyrion understands, but more than understand, Cersei asks if Tyrion agrees. Certainly, he lied. I am yours, sister, for as long as I need to be. Now that the two siblings are getting along quite famously, Tyrion declares that they should have no more secrets. So, who murdered Jon Arryn? Cersei yanks her hand back and declares that she doesn't know. Tyrion reports that Lysa thought Tyrion murdered Jon Arryn, and he's deadly curious where she came by that notion. Cersei's all like, yeah, I'm a fucking villain. Yeah, I'm a fucking villain, but I got standards. She never killed Jon Arryn, despite Ned Stark's suspicions that you were fucking our sweet Jaime. She slapped him. Did you really think I was as blind as father? Tyrion rubbed his cheek. Who you lie with is no matter to me, although it doesn't seem just that you should open your legs for one brother and not the other. She slapped him. Be gentle, Cersei. I'm only jesting with you. If truth be told, I'd sooner have a nice whore. I never understood what Jaime saw in you apart from his own reflection. She slapped him. His cheeks were red and burning, yet he smiled. If you keep doing that, I may get angry. Sorry, I just had to read all that because I'm just imagining the gleam in Martin's eyes when he was writing that. My God, it's really good. Cersei stops hitting then and asks why she should care if Tyrion gets angry. Well, as to that, Tyrion's got a ton of new friends. And Cersei, well, you ain't going to like that, sis. Anyways, how did you kill Robert? Well, as to that, Robert kind of did that himself. They only helped by having Lancel keep fetching Robert strong wine while he went off to hunt the boar. Cersei reports that they cooked the boar afterwards, and it was delish. Truly, sister, you were born to be a widow. Sure, Tyrion had liked Robert Baratheon, but that may have only been because Cersei hated him or that Robert loved to drink. One of the two. Regardless, Tyrion's off to go do stuff. What stuff in particular? Free Jaime, maybe? Well, yeah, sure, at some point, but he needs to figure out how to do that first. First thing, though, he's going to take measure of the city. Also, Cersei, please do not harm Sansa Stark. Whatever you do, look at me, Cersei. Eyes on. Cersei, eye contact. Don't harm Sansa. Outside the small council chambers, Tyrion meets up with Bronn, who tells Tyrion that Timett has gone on to explore the city. Tyrion sighs and says that he sure hopes Timett doesn't murder anyone important in the city. It's really good. But Bronn, you should probably go and find Timett and get the rest of the Mountain Clansmen into some sort of barracks or buildings or something before they kill the shit out of each other and other characters in King's Landing. As for Tyrion, he's on to ride to the Broken Anvil, and no, Bronn, he doesn't want you for an escort. He'll take the captain of Cersei's household guards. It's a power play, you see. An hour later, Tyrion rides from the Red Keep with Captain Vylar and a half dozen Lannister Redcloaks, who I'm assuming had nothing to do with murdering Ned Stark's men in the throne room. Underneath the portcullis, Tyrion notices the heads mounted on spikes high above the walls, and he tells Vylar to get those heads off the walls and give them over to the Silent Sisters. You see, some proper niceties of war have to be observed. When Vylar protests that Joffrey has ordered the heads to stay up on the walls and that the 3 empty spikes are for Renly, Robb Stark, and Stannis, Tyrion says, dude, he's 13. Get those fucking heads down or your head will mount one of the spikes reserved for Renly, Robb, or Stannis. Tyrion's purpose in riding around the city is to kind of take measure of it. It's only half a lie, really. He's got something else in mind, though. But he does take stock in what he sees, and it ain't good. The streets of King's Landing had always been teeming and raucous and noisy, but now they reeked of danger in a way that he did not recall from past visits. A naked corpse sprawled in the gutter near the Street of Looms, being torn at by a pack of feral dogs. Yet no one seemed to care. Watchmen were much in evidence, moving in pairs through the alleys in their gold cloaks and shirts of black ringmail, iron cudgels never far from their hands. And now the price of goods was high. The only good food, and food being one of the prices that's especially high, and the only good food seems to be rats. When Tyrion asks about food, Vylar reports that the Tyrells aren't shipping food in from the Reach. When Tyrion then asks what Cersei's been doing about it, Vylar states that the city watch has been tripled, stonemasons are at work strengthening the walls, and carpenters are making scorpions and catapults. And meanwhile, some weirdo alchemist guild was making pots of wildfire. This gives Tyrion a little bit of pause. Sure, he's sort of pleased that Cersei hasn't been completely idiotic and negligent, but wildfire could turn King's Landing into a fiery maelstrom. And how has Cersei found the money for this? Well, Lord Littlefinger has been helping so very helpfully. In fact, Littlefinger has imposed a tax on people coming in from the King's Road. Yes, that would work, Tyrion said, thinking. Clever and cruel. Tens of thousands were running to King's Landing, and they would give over every penny for their safety behind the walls. But they might have second thoughts if they knew of all the wildfire being stored in the city. Tyrion then comes up to the inn of the Broken Anvil and dismisses Vylar and his men, stating that he's spending the night in the inn. When Vylar warns Tyrion that it won't be safe, Tyrion happily replies that he's left his own mountain clansmen here. He'll be fine, though not entirely safe given his guess. Pushing his way through a myriad of Dungeons & Dragons roleplayers inside the inn, he hears Shay before he sees her. He moves in the direction of her voice and sees what he thinks is an innkeeper talking with her. But as Tyrion approaches, Shay calls out Tyrion's name, and the man turns, and it's Quaithe. Wait, shit, not Quaithe. It's Varys. Tyrion stumbled. Lord Varys, I had not thought to see you here. The others take him. How did he find them so quickly? Varys does his fake apologetic, oh, sorry to bother you a bit, but he was just so taken with when he meet this young lady that was accompanying Tyrion. Shay says that Varys is half right. She's young, but she ain't no lady. Tyrion thinks about Shay and how she's all his and how possessive he feels about her, which, Tyrion, not good, bro. All the same, Tyrion apologizes insincerely to Varys for intruding on him, which leads to Shay talking about how Varys complimented Chella on the ear she'd taken. But no, she'd not taken it off corpses. That's dishonorable. Braver to leave the man alive with a chance to cleanse his shame by winning back his ear, explained Chella. They joke around for a bit, and then Varys asks if Tyrion wants to take some wine. Of course he does, alcoholic that he is, but he also knows what's up. Varys was delivering a message. When he said, I was taken by a sudden urge to meet your young lady, what he meant was, you tried to hide her, but I knew where she was and who she was, and here I am. Tyrion wonders who betrayed him, and Varys seems to answer by telling Shay about how he loves to come through the gate of the gods because the eyes carved on the gates are so expressive, following people around. Tyrion realizes that Varys is bragging about his own eyes, and that's how he knew when Tyrion came in and who he came into the city with. Varys warns Shay to be safe given the amount of lawless armed men about and how he even feared to come to the inn, and Tyrion interprets this for Varys in the rears, thank you Tyrion, by thinking about that Varys was bragging about being able to move about unarmed and unspotted. Shay says that Chella will take an ear if anyone tries to come for Shay, and Varys laughs so loudly, but the laughter isn't in his eyes when he turns to Tyrion. Your young lady has an amiable way about her. I should take very good care of her if I was you. Tyrion does intend to take good care of Shay. Any man who tries to harm her, well, I'm too small to be a Blackyear, and I make no claims to courage. See, I speak the same tongue as you do, eunuch. Hurt her, and I'll have your head. Varys then says he needs to get going to do stuff. Everybody's always doing stuff in King's Landing, but he's happy Tyrion is here. And oh, by the way, seen that red comment that every point of view character in the story we're both in is talking about? Why, yes, Tyrion has. They say it comes as a herald before a king to warn of fire and blood to follow. The eunuch rubbed his powdered hands together. May I leave you with a bit of a riddle, Lord Tyrion? He did not wait for an answer. In a room sit three great men, a king, a priest, and a rich man with his gold. Between them stands a sellsword, a little man of common birth, and no great mind. Each of the great ones bids him to slay the other two. Do it, says the king, for I am your lawful ruler. Do it, says the priest, for I command you in the names of the gods. Do it, says the rich man, and all this gold shall be yours. So tell me, who lives and who dies? Varys bows and leaves. Chella says, well, the rich man lives, of course, but Tyrion is a bit more reflective. Yeah, maybe that guy lives, but who really knows? It really depends on the sellsword. He tells Shay they need to mount the stairs on their way up to the Tyrion's high tower. Get it? Because Tyrion's a secret high tower. Why do you give me that look, Emmett? Stop giving me that look. Anyways, Shay teases Tyrion, saying that he'll miss her when he's up in the Tower of the Hand, and Tyrion admits that, yeah, he will. But he doesn't want Shay to get her ass captured by one of Tywin's goons. His quote-unquote father has promised to murder the next sex worker Tyrion encountered. So Tyrion was willing to be defiant, but only to a point. Then Tyrion and Shay go play hide the cannoli, which is a euphemism for, you know what, just go ask your parents. My lion, Shay whispered when he broke off the kiss to undress. My sweet lord, my giant of Lannister. After they're done doing mommy-daddy wrestling, Tyrion thinks about Shay, realizing how fucking stupid he is for falling for her. Will you never learn, dwarf? She's a whore, damn you. It's your coin she loves, not your cock. Remember, Tysha? But then he looks at her body, touches it, and God, Tyrion, you're so fucking stupid. Shay stirs and looks at him, asking what he's going to do now that he's hand of the king. Something that Cersei will never expect, Tyrion murmured softly against her slender neck. I'll do justice. And that is A Clash of Kings Tyrion 1. You know, when we did our Patreon end of Game of Thrones episodes, I said that my favorite chapters in doing the NotACast podcast review of a Game of Thrones was those later Tyrion chapters, 7 to 9 in particular. And you really see why here in Clash, as the tone, I feel like, really spills over from a Game of Thrones. And like our latter Tyrion chapters from Game, the relationships are really complex. You know, Tyrion's relationship to Shay, Cersei, Varys, Joffrey, Sansa, Sandor Clegane even, They're really complex. And there's the politics, the balancing act Tyrion attempts and fails in part, but we'll get to that eventually, between his lust for power and wanting to do good by the people. But there's also like something else that kind of makes me gravitate to Tyrion's chapters in Clash. I mean, they're so much fun, right? And given how much fun Martin is having in writing Tyrion in Clash, does George see Tyrion as the protagonist? Emmett, and more importantly, Emmett, do you see Tyrion as the protagonist for A Clash of Kings?
Hell yeah, I think Tyrion is inarguably the protagonist of A Clash of Kings, just like Ned was the protagonist of A Game of Thrones. And that's so not just because he has the most chapters in the book, although he does, nor because he's taking over as Hand of the King from Ned. It's because this is a book in large part about the decision-making process behind power, the thoughts behind the public face. And nowhere in A Song of Ice and Fire do we focus more on thoughts and decisions and power than in Tyrion's A Clash of Kings chapters. Which sounds like it might be kind of dry. Like, this is high fantasy, not Robert Caro. But nothing could be further from the truth. As you say, it's just fun. It's just so exciting to sit back and watch Tyrion think. And as I've been saying on Twitter, beyond medieval fantasy and historical fiction, I look at this storyline through the lens of organized crime. Like, Tyrion is Marco Corleone, even every bit as much as he is Richard III, right? Or I think of him as, like, the beginning of Goodfellas, like it's zooming in on him, freeze frame. As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be Hand of the King. But I'd go from rags to riches. See, I'm just going to keep singing, Jeff, just to rub it in your face.
You should. You really should. It's really good to keep rubbing that in my face, because I really want to break out in song, but I can't, apparently. I've been banned from singing. But I think, like, you're right. I think, like, Tyrion does kind of resemble that Michael Corleone figure, but I also think, like, part of Tyrion's appeal in A Clash of Kings is how out of sorts he is in the narrative. Like, having those modernistic sentiments. He's a skeptic. He's a religious skeptic, rather. He loves the science. He's into the reason. He has a physical disability, which makes us sympathetic to him. That works to contrast him to those he interacts with in A Clash of Kings. I mean, a lot of the people that he interacts with, besides Sansa Stark, are real pieces of shit in this book. But, again, like, he's like Michael Corleone, and yeah, he's got some good, genuine views at some level, but ultimately he's got the same weakness that's being held by his less sympathetic counterparts in his family, Tywin and Cersei, and to a lesser extent, Jaime, and they end up being his downfall. He lusts for power, and by the end of Storm, he's calling himself Tywin writ small. Now, and this is important, what's also fascinating about Tyrion is how the narrative drives him to that point of his downfall. While that darkness has been present in Tyrion since A Game of Thrones, remember when he wanted to reduce the Vale to a smoking wasteland, the steady declination of Tyrion's to darkness is kind of sympathetic, right? In that no small part because it's driven by his reaction to external forces. King's Landing rejects him because of his physical deformity, and this leads him to rejecting the city ultimately. Joffrey hates Tyrion, and Tyrion smacks Joffrey around twice in the books, and then falsely he tells Jaime that he murdered Joffrey at the end. Shay, quote unquote, betrays Tyrion, but only because he's endangered her by bringing her to the city itself. And then Tyrion murders her in a sickening act of intimate partner violence. These kind of like stimuli and responses of Tyrion's are the building blocks for Tyrion's overall arc, and they're driving him forward inevitably to he's the villain, of course, as Martin once said in a 1999 Amazon.com interview. But that's still kind of like overarching meta and meta narrative stuff. Before we get there, it's important though to set Tyrion in the as the Clash of Kings political archetype against his A Game of Thrones political archetype and counterpart, Ned Stark.
Yes, indeed. Before we dig into the chapter itself, I think we should start by comparing and contrasting Tyrion's arc in A Clash of Kings to Ned's arc in A Game of Thrones. And George clearly means for us to do so, right? They're both Hands of the King. They have the most POV chapters in their respective books. They even have the same number of chapters. They each get 15 in those two books. There are even parallels just between given chapters as you go along. Like Eddard I was, Ned reuniting with his foster brother Robert and being named Hand. Tyrion I, he reunites with his sister and he's accepted as Hand. Eddard IV was Ned meeting the Small Council. Tyrion IV is the 1-2-3 gambit where he manipulates the Small Council. Eddard IX, you have the battle in the streets of King's Landing. Tyrion IX, you have the riot in the streets of King's Landing. Eddard XII is his big showdown with Cersei in the Godswood. Tyrion XII is his showdown with Cersei regarding Tommen and Alayaya. Eddard XIV, he's betrayed and brought down in the throne room. Tyrion XIV, he's betrayed and brought down on the battlefield. And then their final chapters, Eddard XV is him fever dreaming in the Black Cells. Tyrion 15 is him fever dreaming in this like horrible field hospital or wherever he gets dumped and later found after the battle. Yet while the structure is practically identical, the tone and the focus are very different. As I said in A Game of Thrones, the politics of next chapters, like the investigation and such, didn't really interest me as much as the personal, emotional elements regarding Lyanna and Robert and so on. In part, that's because while we here at the NotACast defend Ned's decision-making for the most part, he was not an especially complex politician. Tyrion is. And the sheer density and speed of his political mind is what makes these chapters so damn delightful to read. Like if the first book, as I was saying earlier, was all about the fall from grace, then it makes perfect sense. Then as book 2 opens, we've gone from the idealistic Ned to the cynical Tyrion. And that's not to say that Tyrion lacks all conscience, as we'll get into as we go along in this book, but that his conscience is filtered through what happened to Ned. He has that line in the show, "I don't mean to follow Ned Stark to the grave." And I think that perfectly sets up the dynamic between this storyline and Ned's storyline.
I think I absolutely agree. And so much of what Tyrion is doing in Clash is rooted through that cynical, pragmatic worldview as you talked about. So I'm curious, right? So when we're doing Ned Stark's chapters for the NotACast podcast back in, the year of our Lord 2018, 2019, something that you were saying back then was that you found Ned Stark's personal side much more compelling than the political side for Ned Stark. So do you find the kind of reverse for Clash of Kings for Tyrion, where the personal side, stuff with Shay and some of the Black Ears and other folks who are in the Mountain Clansmen, is less compelling than the stuff that we're finding in the politics for Tyrion?
Exactly. You said it perfectly. It's an inversion. With Ned, it was like the investigation, okay, but I know already about Jaime and Cersei sleeping together, yada, yada. But so it's like the flashbacks to Lyanna, his conversations with Robert. That's where the heart of that is for me. With Tyrion's chapters in Clash, I kind of get a little weary with the Shay scenes because they're kind of repetitive, as we'll get into towards the end of this episode. But it's the politics. It's Tyrion on the job is what really interests me in this book. Whereas Ned on the job was for me the comparatively less interesting part of Game of Thrones. And you can see that the construction of Tyrion's chapters are all built around establishing him as a politician and how he works as one. And this chapter is like this series of tests that he has to pass, these obstacles he has to overcome to establish himself in King's Landing, because there's a lot of obstacles that could prevent him from doing so. So the first test right away as this chapter opens is Mandon Moore, the Kingsguard in front of the council room. He has to literally get his foot in the door just to begin his reign as Hand. So even before we get to Varys' riddle, this chapter is all about what it means to have power, specifically how you act on potential power to make it actual. Like Tyrion is nominally the hand of the king, but like Ned before him, he's relying on a piece of paper from someone who isn't present, a dead Robert versus, in this case, an absent Tywin. And before he can even step foot in the council chamber to present said paper, he has to get past Mandon Moore, who could not possibly give less of a fuck. Like if Eris Oakhart's place in Sansa 1 was all about how mediocre people fit into bad systems, Sir Mandon is all about how hollow people fit into bad systems. He has no discernible personality whatsoever and is just an instrument of his boss's will. He's a white, basically. Like that's why he's described as a corpse in a shroud. He's a zombie. So Tyrion has to establish himself as his boss, a boss on the level of Cersei and Joffrey. And he does that not purely with an appeal to his father's seal, nor purely through his clever tongue, nor purely through a show of force. It's a combo of all of the above. As he says, Bronn and Timett could likely kill the knight if it came to swords, but it would scarcely bode well if he began by slaying one of Joffrey's protectors. Yet if he let the man turn him away, where is his authority? So you see Tyrion accessing those multiple planes of power and seeing which one is appropriate in the moment. And I think that's really interesting. It's not just we go from idealistic honor-bound Ned to like the more brutish, cynical Tyrion who just like kills everyone in his path. It's that Tyrion is trying to work on more levels than Ned was able to. Does that make sense?
It does. I think Tyrion is working on a lot of different levels, and I think like these obstacles that he faces are part of the levels that he's working at. Mandon Moore is an interesting character, not that interesting, but it's interesting in terms of like presenting like the first challenge, right? If you want, this is a video game. He is the mini boss that Tyrion has to meet in this chapter before he meets the big boss, then, who of course is Varys, who's the much more powerful character, most powerful.
I love that. Yeah, that's perfect.
But I also think it's interesting too that Mandon Moore, when Tyrion asks after him in A Storm of Swords, and I think maybe at the end of Clash of Kings, Start of A Storm of Swords, like Varys got like nothing on him. He's like, yeah, he was in the Vale and he's maybe got family somewhere, but he came with Jon Arryn, and that's it. That's all we know about this guy. Like he has nothing going for him. But at the same time, even though he's got like no real personality, it's interesting the threat he decides to utilize against Mandon Moore to get inside the door, the foot in the door, as you put it so well. Yeah, because Tyrion is using pinpoint precision, kind of the cynical, pragmatic way to insert himself into the small council chambers, because he uses Bronn and Timett, son of Timett, as the way that he's going to get inside the council chambers. As a Valeman, Mandon Moore would be aware of the, quote, savagery and violence that the Mountain Clansmen are known for in the mountain passes and how they've threatened the Vale time and time again. And Timett, son of Timett, as a burned man, is the fiercest warrior among the fiercest warrior clans in all of the Vale. So that's a real threat for a guy like Mandon Moore as a knight. But then he also introduces Bronn as well, and introduces him as the guy who killed Sir Vardis Egan And this is really effective too, because Vardis Egan in the story, I mean, he's obviously a very good knight, and he had a whole lot of disadvantages going into that duel he had with Bronn back in a Game of Thrones. But now he's dead, and the reason why he's dead is that this guy standing in front of Mandon Moore is one who killed him. And Tyrion asked pointedly did you know Sir Vardis Egan? And he's like, yes, I know the man. And Bronn's like, knew him, which of course implies that he's dead, so to speak. So you have to think of Mandon Moore's perspective, be like, oh, this guy killed the best knight in service to Jon Arryn. And he's got Timett, son of Timett, standing here. Do I really want to go mano-mano with the guy who killed Sir Vardis Egan and with Timett, son of Timett? Probably not. So I think it's an effective threat that Tyrion utilizes here. It's also speaking a bit to Tyrion's pragmatic side. I can't imagine a scenario where Ned would use Jory Cassell to push his way violently into the threat of like, I will deploy Jory Cassell to like get into this brothel, so to speak. He always uses the soft power. He uses a lot more soft power than the threat of hard power.
Yeah, that's a great point. It would never even occur to Ned to use his men this way, in part because he's just not as ruthless, but also because he cares more about his men as individuals, I think, than Tyrion does. So he doesn't want to risk their lives. Look at Ned's reaction to when Jory dies. Whereas if Tyrion saw Bronn die, he'd probably care somewhat, but he wouldn't be as devastated as Ned is. Yeah, I love that little line from Bronn when he just says "knew," because unlike the show, I think Bronn's best moments are when he's being very minimalist and just like says just the fewest amount of words possible to get his point across, and I love that. But yeah, it's Tyrion with this multi-track, well-honed political mind. As he said to Jon in the first book, mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone. Or maybe that's what he says in season 1. Regardless, that's the idea he gets across to Jon. You see it at work here. Of course, you also see his biggest vulnerability, his self-consciousness about his stature, which convinces him, as with Tysha, that he cannot truly be loved. As he says, I would only be a small disturbance, sir. It's like that's his preemptive strike, right? That's him, as he said to Jon, kind of making fun of himself before anyone else can. But as we've said before, that doesn't actually really work in terms of armoring Tyrion. He's more vulnerable than ever. As he says, he had passed his first test. Tyrion Lannister shouldered his way through the door, feeling almost tall, which is a great, proud moment for him, but it also just emphasizes most of the time he doesn't feel that way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, he's very much at a physical disability from most of Westeros, as well as we unpacked it significant length in Tyrion's Game of Thrones chapters. Part of that physical disability allows for most of the society to dismiss him, which, interesting, inversely provides him with opportunities in the Clash of Kings, because people underestimate him due to his physical disability, because he has other assets, mainly his brain, his mind, his ability to reason his way and work out different problems. Not all problems, as we're going to talk about with Littlefinger here momentarily, but most of the problems that he encounters, he's able to like figure his way out of them, and that's really important. But that does really that first test does set him up for that second test, which is when Tyrion enters through the door of the small council chambers and on into meeting the 5 counselors who are sitting before him, and they all love him, right? They love Tyrion. Everyone loves Tyrion.
The small council. Remember these knuckleheads? Last time we saw them, they were just sitting around utterly failing to prevent the execution of Ned Stark, except, of course, for Littlefinger, who arranged it. And now here they are trying to pick up the pieces. And as Janos Slynt acknowledges, they are in desperate need of some help. We have sore need of you, my lord. Rebellion everywhere. This grim omen in the sky. Rioting in the city streets. Of course, the fact that Slynt admits that reveals what a shoddy politician he is, as well as being just terrible at his job of keeping the peace at King's Landing. Like, it's one thing to be a bad commander of the Gold Cloaks, but you're not supposed to admit that. The guy who just showed up to take charge. Like, he's handing Tyrion his head on a platter at that point.
Right. It's hilarious the way that Janos Slynt is just so bad at politics. But I mean, he has disadvantage too, being raised as a commoner, so he just didn't have like the upbringing. That being said, though, I mean, he's super shit at his job. I mean, and that's just an enduring feature of who Janos Slynt is, going all the way back to when he's first introduced in Eddard's 6th chapter in the Game of Thrones, where he arrives at the small council complaining about crime in the city. And Lord Renly Baratheon is probably his most sympathetic moment in the story. He says, if you cannot keep the king's peace, Janos, perhaps the city watch should be commanded by someone who can. Stout, jowly Janos Slynt puffed himself up like an angry frog, his bald plate reddening. Aegon the dragon himself could not keep the peace, Lord Renly. I need more men. And there, Janos couldn't keep the peace for the king, for the hands turning, because he didn't have enough men. But now, with refugees pouring in, it's kind of a similar issue in King's Landing, where you have a lot of people coming to the city at the same time. But that speaks more to his incompetence, because as Tyrion makes his rounds later in the chapter, Captain Vylar reveals that the city guard has been tripled in terms of size. So is the issue really that King's Landing is just so ridden with crime and that Janos needs more men? Or is there, almost as if the problem isn't that there's too few cops in the city. Almost maybe there's another issue at work in the fact that crime is kind of out of control in King's Landing.
It's almost like there's systemic corruption being underwritten by violence, and you can't solve that by just throwing money at it. Is that your point, Jeff? Nah, it can't possibly be it. But yeah, and this immediately they're exposing their weaknesses, and Tyrion zeroes in on it. He describes Slint as a smug frog who had gotten rather above himself, immediately setting up what he's going to do to Janos. He also takes note of how ponderous and pretentious Pycelle is, stroking his beard, and of course we know how that's going to turn out. And that's not just because Tyrion is perceptive or because he just doesn't like these people, because this is the job he was sent to do. He was sent here to deal with this motley crew. And while, again, Ned was more perceptive than his rep suggests, he has that line about the flatterers and the fools and that he thinks he already knows which are which. Tyrion is prepared to weaponize his insights far more effectively. He puts them into practice better than Ned does. He knows not to trust Littlefinger, even if, as it turns out, he feels like he can't afford to get rid of him. Littlefinger, meanwhile, as you say, mentions the fate of those last two hands, Ned and Jon Arryn, which he himself arranged, which is, a nice little subtle unspoken threat, although he's also making an enemy out of Tyrion when he doesn't have to, which is a pretty consistent weakness of Littlefinger's. Varys, meanwhile, is just like oozing about unctuously in this scene because he's waiting to make his own claim on Tyrion's attentions in private because he, I think, it generally is more restrained and smarter than Littlefinger on the whole. Wild opinion, I know. But I think equally important as who is here is who isn't here. And that's what Tyrion zeroes in on. The person missing very palpably from this room is Barristan Selmy. And again, the difference between Ned and Tyrion. Like, Ned respected Barristan's honor, but he didn't seem to understand how to politically make use of it or its political significance. He just liked Barristan as a man. He didn't seem aware of this PR relationship, the way Barristan, as Tywin says, lent honor to whomever he served. Tyrion understands that perfectly well, that losing Barristan to another king is a huge political blow. And Cersei admits, I never thought of that. And Tyrion's like, yeah, that's why I'm here, because you didn't think of that. That's how he starts making the case that Cersei needs him.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, Barristan represents so many things that are lacking in this small council, right? I mean, there's the part of the thing that the Lannisters, they have a decent grasp on kind of the hard, crude politics of power politics. If I kill you, that means that you're not a threat to me anymore. But what they don't have a grasp of is on the soft power politics and on the ideals and the optics that go into like making an actual good case for your party and for your cause. So having Sir Barristan on the small council should be what should have happened, because what he represents gives the Lannisters legitimacy that goes beyond simply their name and the fact that they have someone sitting on the Iron Throne. Because ultimately, it's not just the Iron Throne that's important. You have to have other symbols of power too. You have to have the faith. You have to have some sort of shining example of the knights. And sorry to say for you, Jaime stands, and I can count myself as sort of one of them. Jaime's just not going to count there. I mean, he's known as the Kingslayer by the common folk and by the peasants in Westeros, and he's not really going to cut despite the fact that Cersei thinks like she's done this amazing thing. She's dismissed Sir Barristan, and now Jaime's here because that's like everybody loves Jaime, right? Does everybody love Jaime?
And even if they did, he's not here. He's not here to walk around being the great, glorious, golden example of a knight. He's rotting in a dungeon at Riverrun and will for the entire book until Catelyn lets him go. So there's no one to fill that void, and so you have Tyrion and Cersei, kind of the relative outsiders of the Lannister clan, scrapping over how to fill that hole. And I really love the Tyrion-Cersei dynamic. Mm-hmm. It's one of my favorite relationships in the series. I honestly think it's more interesting than the Jaime-Cersei dynamic. Because I had forgotten until we reread A Game of Thrones what an Ice Queen Cersei really is in Book 1. We don't see the fiery attitude we associate with her character because our primary POVs on her in that book are the Starks, her enemies, and in front of whom she's fronting constantly. But boy, does she drop that pretense quickly when her eternally obnoxious little brother walks in the room. She rants and he snarks. She slaps him physically. He slaps back verbally. It's similar to the Tyrion-Tywin dynamic we were talking about in Book 1 in terms of the years of poison always working their way to the surface between these two and preventing any genuine cooperation. But the power dynamic is totally different and very fluid at this specific moment. We're in sibling territory now, and so the stakes and tone are very different than a parent-child relationship. To be clear, like Tyrion and Cersei obviously can't stand each other. And indeed, as of Feast and Dance, they both want the other dead more than anything in the world. But, I mean, that's actually kind of a parallel, right? That really kind of makes them more similar than they would care to admit. And they're just so familiar with each other that they're never really in a hurry to end their conversations. Like the Tyrion Cersei scenes just go on and on and on, and I mean that as a compliment. It's good. It's a realistic way of capturing people who can't stand each other, but also can't quit each other. You know, it's like slipping into an old, comfortable armchair whenever they fight. They're so used to it. They're not exactly enjoying it, but they just understand this dynamic so well. Like Tyrion knows, right, that he's not the Lannister man Cersei was hoping would walk through that door. He was at the bottom of that list for her. So what he does is he leverages the other two, the men she does want in the room. Dad sent me, and I'm going to save Jaime. He knows that's how he can get Cersei. Cersei, meanwhile, is looking at him the same way Catelyn was looking at Jon when Robb decided to name him heir, this traitorous termite who's going to climb the ladder of chaos and ruin everything for our family. Both of them are claiming to be the center of Lannister power in the capital, and so you get this constant question in the Clash of Kings, is this town big enough for the two of them? And like Tyrion doesn't need Cersei to help him run things day to day. She's not going to be very good at it. But what he does need for her right now is to just not lock him up as soon as he walks through the door. And of course, she also has useful information regarding what the hell happened at the end of a Game of Thrones. I mean, the reader knows about that, but Tyrion doesn't. He has to find out what went down. So once again, it's not that Ned's naivete is being replaced by pure power politics. It's that Tyrion understands you have to make use of every tool in your toolbox, that you have to apply pressure on this pedal and then on that one as you need in the moment. Like the paper shield he has, it matters, not because it's equivalent to force, but because it gets his foot in the door so he can then work on acquiring that force. It's a step-by-step process. He has to agree to be Cersei's hand, lying through his teeth as he says that, until he can acquire a monopoly on violence in the capital, which is what he works on over his next few chapters so he can operate independently of her. And even beyond the politics, though, in terms of their character relationships, like there's a real sadness, I think, at the core of this dysfunctional dynamic between Cersei and Tyrion, because they could have been great, powerful allies against the patriarchy, right? If they could ever get their shit together. Tyrion takes endless shit for his stature. Cersei takes endless shit for her gender. Like, you could easily imagine them seeing that in common and like growing up as a mutually supportive team. But instead, as so often happens with people who are marginalized in different ways, they turn on each other, wrestling for scraps of dad's approval and society's approval. I mean, of course, we later learn about how Cersei treated Tyrion as a child, like grabbing his penis and twisting it. And I don't think he's fully joking about wanting to have sex with her. So I don't put all of this on Tywin. There's more than enough dysfunction to go around in House Lannister.
Oh, yeah. I think you bring up a number of wonderful points. And I think something that we're seeing in Clash and Tyrion's point of view is how he's still utilizing the same tactics that he used to get in the door, so to speak, to like save his head, namely in the form of like Bronn. You remember how Bronn's introduced by taking Tyrion's side at the combat that they have up in the Eyrie itself. And the reason why he does this is because of the promise of gold, the fact that he is Tywin Lannister's son, and that continues to buy Tyrion loyalty of the clansmen who end up accompanying him down to King's Landing as well. So Tyrion is still relying on his father for the power that he has right now. At the same time, Cersei's dynamic is also interesting too, in that she is relying on going back to daddy. Like, why isn't my dad coming to help me and save me? Like, I told him he needed to come. Like, this is intolerable, the way that this has all worked itself out. So I think we're seeing like a real interesting dynamic too. You know, when we talk back to like to Tyrion IX from Game of Thrones, we talked about how all of the Westerman lords are all just politically inert because they've all relied on Tywin Lannister for the entirety of their political regime and to make all the decisions. And I think we're also seeing the dynamic here too, where you have, you know, Cersei and Tyrion, who are now having to operate independently of Tywin while still having him in their back pocket, or still having them in the position where they want him to be. Namely, Tyrion wants, you know, the position and the power that Tywin has. Cersei wants Tywin to come with his army to defend King's Landing too. Now, the other thing you also want to point out too is you brought up about how Tyrion is joking, so totally joking about wanting to have sex with Cersei, right? Really totally joking. He's not joking, guys. I mean, I think something that Tyrion uses humor for a lot of the times is like he uses it as a kind of way to obscure like the reality by like, it's just a joke, guys. But, you know, when we get to A Dance with Dragons, and after Tyrion has had this, you know, great unraveling of his personality, you know, he's the widow of the waterfront, asks why he would want to support Daenerys Targaryen. And, you know, he says, oh, you know, Dany can have whatever she wants of me. Sage counsel, savage wit, a bit of tumbling, my cock if she desires it, my tongue if she does not. I will lead her armies or rub her feet as she desires. And the only reward I ask is that I might be allowed to rape and kill my sister. So what when we look back at this chapter now in the context of that of Dany 7 from Tyrion 7 from a Dance of Dragons, you really do get the sense that this is underlining a lot of what Tyrion is going for. That he does have a jealousy of Jaime, the fact that Jaime has had a sexual relationship with his sister, and that he kind of wants one too, and that's really bad. I mean, it's really bad that this family is so toxic and corrupted that they're all fucking each other, right? I think that's bad, right? Can I make that moral statement? Is that okay to make that type of moral statement?
Absolutely. They're just recreating the worst aspects of the Targaryens, and you have Tyrion and Cersei in the middle of this Lannister power spectrum, right? And at one end of it, you have Tywin, who wants to build his glorious Lannister legacy and wants to drag everyone along with him to do it. At the other end, you have Joffrey, who really unravels that project as much as he possibly can. Joffrey doesn't appear in this chapter, unlike Sansa 1, but his presence looms large nonetheless. When the Boiled Leather Audio Hour did some episodes on each book individually, they argued that Tyrion and the Clash of Kings doesn't have like a clear through line the way Ned does with his investigation in the Game of Thrones, but I somewhat disagree with that. I think you do see a through line, and it's this. He, meaning Tywin, knows that your son's short reign has been a long parade of follies and disasters. That suggests that someone is giving Joffrey some very bad counsel. That is why he sent me, to put an end to these follies and bring your son to heel. So that's what Tyrion's working on. That's the overall goal for him in this book. And while he plays that game quite effectively regarding the small council and even Cersei for the most part, Joffrey is really his Achilles heel. Like Tyrion can fire Janos Slynt. He can throw Pycelle in jail. He can offer Myrcella to the Martells without consulting Cersei once he gets enough power on his own to pull it off. But no matter what he does, he can't remove Joffrey from power. And that's a problem not only because Joffrey is a sadistic little shit who instigates riots and has valuable prisoners beaten, but because he hates Tyrion's guts. And that just is inherently going to have an impact on how good a job Tyrion can do. Unlike Cersei, Joffrey cannot be persuaded that he needs Tyrion's help to stay in charge. So as Tyrion acknowledges by the time they get to the Purple Wedding, the ground will never be secure under Tyrion's feet as long as Joffrey is king. He will never be safe. And Bronn, of all people, kind of anticipates the Tyrells' move when he notes that Tommen would be far easier to control. But Tyrion can't let himself go there. Not yet. He will be by a dance with dragons, as you say. He will get to that place where he's actively, viciously turning on his family. But right now, he's in this kind of liminal state where he can see so clearly that Joffrey is the worst. He's more enraged by it than Cersei or the Council or the Kingsguard. But even as he acts on that disgust sometimes, slapping him and threatening him and saving Sansa, at the end of the day, every move Tyrion makes in this book is to ensure that Joffrey's butt stays on the Iron Throne. So as with Littlefinger kind of poking at Tyrion unnecessarily, every time Tyrion antagonizes Joffrey, as much as we might cheer him on, all he's really doing is letting a powerful person know that he's their enemy without reducing their power. And so long before Mandon Moore tries to kill Tyrion at the Blackwater, I think we can already glimpse the source of his downfall here, and that's his relationship to Joffrey.
You're absolutely right. I think, like, well, one of the things I find so interesting about Tyrion and Clash is that he doesn't really have an ideology that he's espousing besides save his family. But at the same time, like, Tyrion is very, very conscious of who Joffrey is, right? He's known who Joffrey is since his first chapter in A Game of Thrones, the chapter where Joffrey is there, like, the wailing of women and all that sort of stuff, and Tyrion slaps him around, which of course sets the relationship on a bad moment before we even like get to Clash of Kings, where they have to interact on a day-to-day basis, or as little as often as Tyrion would prefer. I think the other thing that's interesting about Tyrion's relationship too is as you're progressing through Clash of Kings, Tyrion often takes this perspective of, well, yeah, I'm serving Joffrey, but he really doesn't want to know about that because he would just like turn that to shit. Like thinking about the wildfire, thinking about the chain, like the different things that Tyrion integrates into the story. And I think it's really interesting because at some subconscious level, Tyrion has to realize that Joffrey is bad at his job, like that he should not be the king, that Bronn is right, that Tommen should be king, or that Stannis should be the king, right? Anyone should be the king besides this guy who's sitting on the king right on the throne right now. And I think it's this part of the poisonous, toxic family dynamic that we see at work here, and that the Lannisters and that they have to like support each other to bring the one person onto the Iron Throne and keep their ass seated on the throne itself. But they're not supporting the best person for the throne, and then they're all backstabbing each other at the end, anyways. To include everyone thinking that Tyrion murdered the person that he's ostensibly backing, that he sacrifices a lot for in A Clash of Kings. And I think that dynamic is interesting and also toxic. And also, I would like to have seen probably a little more exploration of Tyrion's subconscious and how his feelings about Joffrey evolve in the series. I think we don't really get his perspective on Tommen on the Iron Throne until A Dance of Dragons, till he's clear and far away in Pentos. And I think we would be, and I think it'd be interesting to see how that dynamic changes when we get into the Windswear, and hopefully we have some more Tyrion and Westeros dynamics going on.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's not only that Tyrion recognizes that Joffrey is horrible, it's that there's no plan to make Joffrey better.
Right.
What are we going to do when this guy turns 16? And there's really no way we can hold him back anymore. And there's no plan. Tyrion doesn't have a plan for that. Cersei doesn't have a plan for that. Tywin alludes to having a plan for that, but he doesn't carry it out unless you think he was in on Joffrey's death, which I don't think he was. So it's just this gaping hole in the middle of the Lannister plan, and none of them can do anything about it. And that gets at just the contradictions at the heart of power, and that it's not as simple as just taking what you want, because Cersei did take what you want, and now the way she did it and who she did it for is making it fall apart in her hands. And that's what makes Varys' riddle really the core of this chapter. So Tyrion goes through the city streets, he gets to the inn where he meets Shay, and Varys is suddenly there, and it is in a much more kind of knowing, powerful way than what he was in the council chamber. And the riddle gets spread over 2 chapters, unlike in the show. Mm-hmm. We only get the question, the riddle itself, in this chapter, and Varys' answer comes in Tyrion 2, so we'll talk about that then. For this chapter's purposes, though, I think there are 2 important points to make about Varys' riddle. One is that George is setting up A Clash of Kings as being a book not only about power, but about competing conceptions of where power comes from and what power even is. I mean, Game of Thrones touched on that, but by design, it couldn't dig deep because it was about the scales falling from one's eyes. As I said, it was about power coming from the outside more than the inside. So I think we're supposed to ponder Varys' riddle throughout this whole book, not just in Tyrion's chapters. What he's talking about applies to Stannis and Renly. It applies to Arya and Jaqen and Hagar. It applies to Dany and her dragons. And you see all these different answers to the riddle, so to speak. We do see like idealized romantic versions of where the power comes from, like with the Reed's oath to Bran when they show up at Winterfell. It's like, we offer you hearth and harvest if you protect us, and Bran says, be welcome. It's that the good feudal relationship working like it's supposed to. We see more cynical takes, like also in Bran's story, the Lord of the Crossing game that the young Walders Frey bring to Winterfell, which kind of reduces power politics down to its most brutal core. And you see takes in between, like with Sandor talking to Sansa about how power works, or Jaime talking to Catelyn about how power works, and you can see the ideals they used to believe in and how they've fallen from them. All these different conceptions of what is this thing power that everyone's fighting over. And the other important point I think to make about the riddle here is that it's interesting that Varys is even bothering to do this. Like he's reaching out to Tyrion individually and posing him this philosophical question. Like, he never got this philosophical with Ned until the very end in the Black Cells, when it kind of didn't really matter anymore. Varys thought he could make use of Ned in terms of keeping Robert alive until his Targaryen restoration was ready to go. But on the whole, Varys, like Cersei, saw the Starks as unexpected interlopers, upsetting all his carefully laid plans. He wasn't trying to integrate them. Varys seems to be trying to integrate Tyrion into his plan. He regards Tyrion right from the start as both a worthy opponent and a potentially valuable asset. I mean, admittedly, he does turn the information he starts acquiring here against Tyrion at his trial, but I don't see any indication that betrayal was his plan all along. Like, I think you got to consider what Varys' priorities are at this moment in time. Having failed to keep Robert alive, which I believe him when he says that was his goal in Book 1, his new priority is preventing the Baratheons from reuniting Westeros and thus being able to stand firm against his perfect prince. So in terms of who the Lannisters come up with to lead that agenda, he might have been expecting Tywin to show up, or Kevon, or Adam Marbrand. But Tyrion is a lion of a different color, and I don't think Varys knows him particularly well up to this point. So Varys needs to get a sense of who he's going to be dealing with. And the very fact that he concludes this conversation between them by trying to get Tyrion to think critically about power suggests to me that this is another test Tyrion has passed, and that indeed, going forward, Varys will be working closely with him. And for all that Tyrion bitterly curses and threatens Varys in the privacy of his own mind here, he does come to trust and work with Varys, I would say, more than he does with Pycelle or Littlefinger. And I don't, it's maybe for the most part just an alliance of convenience, but I think there's something deeper than that, or Varys wouldn't reveal his backstory to Tyrion, of all people, the way he does later in the book. I think at some level they make a connection that was not there with Ned and Varys. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the best way to respond to that, because I think, like, I look at Varys this way. So Varys in A Game of Thrones, I think, was attempting to set Ned up as his man, right? So in Tyrion's second chapter in A Clash of Kings, we have the famous firing of Janos Slynt, which is just great. It's fantastic, where he's kicked out of the small council and kicked out of King's Landing. But Tyrion thinks about it after he names, God, I'm gonna fuck his name up again, because we were talking about this in pre-production.
Jocelyn Bywater.
Jocelyn Bywater. There you go. Thank you. Where he thinks that where he replaces Janos Slynt with Jocelyn Bywater as the commander of the City Watch, and he thinks for a moment that have I replaced one of Littlefinger's men with one of Varys' men? And that's interesting, because I wonder if the dynamic here is a little bit broader for Varys, whether he is attempting to secure people in advance of young Griff coming to Westeros. And maybe he's identified Tyrion as being that outsider person that he could then supplant in to claim the Lannister mantle, because he has the Lannister last name. He is the son of Tywin Lannister. And that could be the way that he works. I mean, there's that great theory that we'll talk about later in A Clash of Kings about whether Tyrek Lannister was secured and stolen by Varys in order that he could have like a, Lord Paramount of the Westerlands in place when young Griff arrives, and then he can just have kind of a government in a box, so to speak. So realm in a box. So as young Griff arrives, I've got not Gendry. I've got Edric Storm to be the Lord of the Stormlands. I've got Tyrion Lannister to be the Lord of the Westerlands. I've got the government ready to go, so the continuity of the government can continue, and it's not going to be this big upheaval of the way that Robert's Rebellion and some of the other rebellions, especially Aegon's Conquest, were, especially the Blackfire and Dance of the Dragons rebellions. So I do think that that's what potentially is going on at work here, and I do think that's why Varys is placing a lot more interest in Tyrion Lannister. I think that Tyrion also represents a near peer in terms of the intellectual abilities, the way that, not that Ned was dumb, because we're in the pro Ned side here. Ned is not dumb. Ned is very smart, but not the same level as Varys, Littlefinger, or Tyrion for sure.
Not the same tone, not the same kind of delight in intellectual sparring and conversation. I think Varys, just enjoys talking to Tyrion, which I think Varys doesn't necessarily experience that very much, and I think he likes it. But so then Varys leaves and Tyrion is left alone with Shae. And so this is the closest we get to a personal, emotional element in Tyrion's Clash of Kings chapters to match those in Ned's. And while it's not nearly as moving, for me, I don't think it's necessarily meant to be. I think George uses the Tyrion-Shae relationship effectively to expose the massive blind spots in Tyrion's worldview and how they turn dark and violent over time. Like the question becomes not so much, aren't we invested in this relationship? It becomes about, what will Tyrion do in order to hold on to Shae? I would say you could go ask Simon Silvertongue, but you can't. Unless you go down to Flea Bottom and start talking to the Bulls of Brown, you can't. And that I think is the way the relationship gets used effectively. I think these scenes with Shae are kind of repetitive. Like I can't really remember which happens in what scene, as opposed to like Jon and Ygritte, which has a real arc, and I can remember exactly what order things occur in because it's built up perfectly. Tyrion and Shae, not so much, but I think obviously she has to be there in terms of tying everything in with Tysha and Tywin and so forth. But I also think their relationship works well in establishing, as you say, Tyrion's darker side underneath the surface of A Clash of Kings.
Right. I think that you make a great point that Ygritte and John's relationship is really strong, and you can remember like key points in the relationship, like Tyrion and Shae. I'm like, wait, when does Shae show up again in the books in A Clash of Kings? And I'm like flipping through the Tyrion Clash chapters, and I'm like, I really should know this, but I don't. And it's because the relationship isn't super. It's like you were saying at the very beginning about how the politics of Tyrion's story is much more compelling than the personal for Tyrion's story. Shae is not as interesting of a character, so much to the extent that George R. R. Martin, after Sibel Kelly was cast as Shae, said that, this is a better Shae than was in my books. So you're like, okay. Okay, but regardless, we are kind of in the form of Shae, we are getting a further sense of Tyrion's toxicity in terms of his feelings of ownership over Shae, because he's making it pretty clear that he feels like he owns her. He has like a hold of her in ways that are really unhealthy. And it should be painfully clear at this point that Shae is viewing this relationship really, really differently. Tyrion sees Shae and he's projecting Tysha all over, as we talked about in Tyrion 7, the analysis there. But here, she's very obviously seeing him as a Jon. And Tyrion, like, he knows this at a conscious level, at a rationalistic, reasonable level. Fool, he thought to himself afterwards, he lay in the center of the sagging mattress amidst the rumpled sheets. Will you never learn, dwarf? She's a whore, damn you. It's your coin she loves, not your cock. Remember Tysha? But Tyrion, he can't help but falling for Shae as he once did for Tysha. Yet when his fingers trailed lightly over one nipple, It stiffened at the touch, and he could see the mark on her breast where he'd bitten her in his passion. That's a signal, I think, to readers on Martin's part that despite Tyrion's penchant for reason, he isn't an emotional void, right? I think he's not some sort of Borg figure going up there emotionless. The problem though is that Tyrion is choosing to fix his emotions on someone who he consciously knows doesn't love him back, but he still wants her to love him back. He still wants her to be his girlfriend. And it all really goes back to the backstory and to Taisha, the girl he fell for when he was a teenager. And Jamie's quote revealed that she was only a sex worker who didn't love him for anything more than his money. And that's it. It becomes ever more toxic when Tyrion learns the truth at the end of A Storm of Swords from Jamie. And as we'll find out in Tyrion's final Storm of Swords chapter, who other than his own father, Tywin, shares that trait with Tyrion Lannister of being the guy who seems like this super reasonable, realistic dude who is never like taking emotions into account. Well, and then Tyrion finds his former lover, his former mistress, and poor Michelle in Tywin's bed at the end of the story. So they both share that trait. Really, really great. Really great. Really bad. Not great. Not big. Terrible. Very, very bad.
It's a perfect nightmare scenario there, and it's built up to very effectively. It's kind of, as I described, like the pressure point where House Lannister falls apart. But yeah, I think you can see it as George setting up both Tyrion's strengths and weaknesses, right? In this chapter, you can see him setting up why he's going to rise so high and also why he's going to fall so low. And I can't think of a better use of a character's first chapter in a book than that. Mm-hmm. So I think that about covers our analysis of the episode proper. Moving on into foreshadowing and groundwork for Clash of Kings, Tyrion I. Obviously, right from the get-go, in the chilly white raiment of the Kingsguard, Sir Mandon Moore looked like a corpse in a shroud. And yeah, I'll bet he does, given that he'll try to make a corpse out of Tyrion at the Blackwater before ending up one himself. And that cloak indeed serves as his shroud as he sinks into the river. And I love that George sets this up from the very first line of Tyrion's very first chapter in the book. There it is, right there, how it's going to end. Also, yeah, as you said, Jamie's line about Mandon Moore, that he was the most dangerous of the Kingsguard because his face gave no hint as to what he might do next. And that almost gets Tyrion killed.
It does, and it almost gets him killed at the Battle of the Blackwater because Tyrion's all like, "Oh, I'm done with battles." It's interesting too, and I'll talk about this in a second. But it's the way that he talks about how he's done with battles. It's very much a callback to like George's thing about how, the hippie generation is all like, "Oh, well, the battles were bad, so we're going to make like peace, love, and sex, so to speak." But But some people you would read like the older source and they'd be like, love like the sounding of the drums and the horns and the comradeship and friends. But that's not Tyrion's perspective because he's like, I'm done with battles. I'm done with wars. But he ain't. Not only is he going to fight at the Blackwater, the climax of Clash of Kings, but he's also there at the Battle of Fire at the start of the Winds of Winter. He's one of our primary point of views besides Barristan and Victarion. He's one of our 3 point of views that's going to be witnessing events from the Battle of Fire. So that's all interesting. I also think too, like George has often said that he is the character that most resembles Tyrion in terms of personality. So when we're talking about like George, like kind of projecting himself into Tyrion, like he's making kind of a little bit of a meta commentary by having, Tyrion be the guy saying like, yeah, well, I didn't really like battle all that much. I didn't think it was all that great. Didn't really have a good time with it. So I'm happy to be out of battle. I'll never see battle again. But of course he will see battle again.
Quite a bit of it. And yeah, he objects to battle not because it's morally horrifying, because it's just so damn uncomfortable with the armor and the horses and the noise. And of course, that's why Littlefinger doesn't want to be in battle either, because they just prefer to have other people do their killing for them and try to keep their hands clean. Another kind of interesting bit of expositional info dump here when Tyrion and Littlefinger are sparring. Tyrion gives this little speech. Aerys Targaryen's last hand was killed during the sack of King's Landing. Though I doubt he'd had time to settle into the tower, he was only hand for a fortnight. The one before him was burned to death, and before them came 2 others who died landless and penniless in exile and counted themselves lucky. And all of those characters actually end up being important, or at least mentioned to varying degrees going forward. So this qualifies as our first mentions of Rossart the Pyromancer, who was the one who was killed during the sack by Jaime, as it turns out. Carlton Chelsted is the one who was burned to death. And we find out from Jaime that was because he defied Aerys' plan regarding the wildfire. Among the first ones who died landless and penniless in exile was Orton Merryweather's grandsire, but Orton Merryweather himself shows up again on Cersei's small council in A Feast for Crows. And most importantly of all, the other one who supposedly died landless and penniless in exile, but it turns out didn't, is John Connington, who of course will be very significant as we get into the later books in the series. So, again, as we always say with these bits, who knows how much of this George had in mind at this point? But those qualifiers are mentioned of those first 4 characters. So bag them and tag them, folks. Rack them up. The mentions are coming hard and fast now.
Right. And it's interesting. This is around the time that George likely started to think more deeply about the possibility of having an exiled Targaryen, fake Targaryen in the form of Aegon coming into the narrative. We do see our first canonical reference to the Mummer's Dragon in Dany's House of the Undying chapters. So does this at this point work as foreshadowing for the entry of John Connington and the Merryweathers into the story? It's hard to say with certainty, but I do think that maybe growing from the gardening that we see in a lot of what George is writing, and that he ends up using these kind of like, oh, this exiled character who was away and died penniless. Well, we can bring him back, right? And we can also bring potentially Aegon the Sixth Targaryen back too. Aegon the Sixth Targaryen back as well. You never know, and I think it's one of those questions I would love to ask George after the end of A Song of Ice and Fire, after he finishes it, about whether he would be interested in talking about the development of some of these characters and subplots that have become integral to the story, especially when we get to A Dance with Dragons. But we're only about like a week or two away from that, so I guess I will be able to like get George on one of our Fever Dream episodes, of course, and ask him about it.
Absolutely right. He just mentioned Fever Dream on Twitter, or at least his account did. It was a wonderful bit of coincidence.
It was indeed. So we also have Tyrion's short tour through King's Landing, and he observes that the city's on the brink of starvation, with the Tyrells not shipping in any food, and they're only bringing in food we've later learned on from House Rosby and Stokeworth. And that really nicely sets up the quote-unquote food riot, a quote-unquote organic uprising, which it's not an organic uprising, guys. We'll talk about that later in the class. At least it's not entirely an organic uprising. I can see your face, Evan. I can see what you're thinking. That like
it's both. It's both. It's Varys, I think, taking advantage of a spark that's already there and fanning it to serve his own purposes. But that'll wait for our big theory discussion when we get to a Tyrion IX. That's a hell of a chapter in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely is.
One little detail I'd forgotten about until this reread is that Varys mentions the eyes on the gates of King's Landing, referring, of course, metaphorically to his spies. But that's an image that comes up at Qarth when Dany goes through the threefold gates of Qarth. One of them is covered with, I think, golden eyes, which I think is an interesting connection. One way I think you can think about Qarth is it's like an entire city of Varys's, where like everyone kind of behaves like him, which is both interesting and not, because if everyone's Varys, then it's less compelling than when you have this one guy who's different from everyone moving around. But I just thought that was an interesting little touch. And yeah, that's another thing to maybe throw in the George question log, is what are you getting at by having those two eyes on the gates commonality in Clash of Kings? Again, if nothing else, it establishes that overall aura of paranoia, which I think is very important.
And the paranoia is just it's an enduring feature of Tyrion, because he starts to like go out in disguise from the Red Keep himself. And yes, he has Varys as his ally, but he's still not trusting Varys totally. And he's often wondering whether Varys is his best friend or his worst enemy. Like he's in that constant state of who can I actually trust in the city? And the actuality is that no one. He can't trust anyone in the city. It's the worst of all time. Finally, we have here for foreshadowing before we get into our before we get into our major theory discussion, is we have the first canonical reference to wildfire. We did look this up beforehand. Maybe we're wrong about this, but we think it's the first time that wildfire is mentioned in A Song of Ice and Fire, where you have the reference that Cersei is creating pots of wildfire to defend King's Landing itself. So maybe that'll be important for later in the books. I don't know. Maybe it'll also be important for when Daenerys comes to King's Landing with fire and dragons, who apparently dragons and magic make the wildfire that much more potent. I don't know. I don't know. I don't read, so I don't know for sure.
Any number of possibilities there. But yeah, I'd forgotten wildfire does not come up, as far as I can tell, in book one at all. It's always amazing to realize how many elements we kind of take for granted in this series weren't even present in book one or even book two. Like the Blackfires don't show up in book two. They only get mentioned by, I think Stannis is the first one to bring up Daemon Blackfire in A Storm of Swords. So it's fun to watch George start integrating not just these side elements, but important, like wildfire matters. Like when you get to the Battle of Blackwater, and again, when we're going to see whatever version of Cersei shenanigans that we saw in season 6 in the book. So it's something that we'll talk about later, that George is drawing in part from real history with like Greek fire, but he's also ramping it up in fantasy style to 11. So it's a fun element, and one I can't wait to talk more about. So I think that about wraps us up for foreshadowing groundwork. Moving on to our discussion portion, and I get when we talk about Tyrion's chapters being different from Ned's, and that they're more kind of outward and politically focused. Part of that is just the dialogue scenes. There's just lots of long, dense, snappy dialogue scenes in Tyrion's chapters, and this might be a controversial statement, but I actually think seasons 2 through 4 of Game of Thrones do a better job on the whole with Tyrion's dialogue than A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords. Heresy, I know.
I'm shocked. I think I'm going to have to end the podcast. Right? This has been a really nice run. I hope you guys have appreciated the NotACast podcast going for 77 episodes. We're all done after this point because we're never going to recover from this ever again. But no, I think it's interesting. I think like you're right. I think that Peter Dinklage, especially in this casting choice, was good on Martin's part, and that Tyrion is a bit better in seasons 2 to 4. And it's interesting when you talk about like the why this came about. I think like Dinklage was actually the first choice to play Tyrion and the first person that was officially cast for Game of Thrones himself. And this came from a 2014 interview with Peter Dinklage from the New York Times, where it says, from the beginning, Dinklage was the first choice for the role of Tyrion, according to Benioff and the show's co-creator Dan Weiss, who observes that Dinklage's, quote, core of humanity covered by a shell of sardonic dry wit is pretty well in keeping with the character from the books. And George himself said in 2009, and playing Tyrion Lannister will be Peter Dinklage, who was almost everyone's dream casting for the role. He certainly was mine. And then finally, as of 2014, it's interesting that Peter Dinklage has apparently not read A Song of Ice and Fire. And he made this confession apparently on a panel that he was on with George, I think maybe at the San Diego Comic-Con. And George R. R. Martin allegedly did not take it well that Peter Dinklage had not read A Song of Ice and Fire. So that's a little background as to Peter Dinklage's casting as Tyrion Lannister. But Emmett, I'm curious. You said that Tyrion in seasons 2 to 4 is better than Clash and A Storm of Swords. Why is that? And remember, you only have 3 to 5 million people watching you right now on YouTube who will all hold you to account. Me especially.
30 to 50 feral hogs will hold me to account. Absolutely.
That's a joke.
Right. I mean, obviously, Tyrion has some great, amazing, crackling dialogue in the books, too. I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but I think the show for a few seasons was just doing a tighter and more focused job of it than George was. Like, Varys' riddle is a great example. In the show, it's a single scene. You get the riddle and Varys' explanation of it. One great scene. And here he spreads out the question and the answer over 2 scenes in 2 different chapters. It's still fine, but I think it's less punchy and less effective. Or just like line choices, like when you get to Janos Slynt and his firing in Tyrion's next chapter. And when he brings up his honor, Tyrion in the book says, "Oh, what honor was that?" Which is a fine line, but it's not as good as Peter Dinklage going on. "Not questioning your honor, Lord Janos." Perfect pause. "I'm denying its existence." That's just great. And Dinklage nails it. It's just better. Or like the classic 1, 2, 3 scene that everyone loves, where he's manipulating the various council members by feeding them information, seeing which of them go to Cersei. It's so tight in the show because they got the magic of editing at work, and they just cut from scene to scene in the same room with the 3 of them, and it's like perfect execution. You get exactly what's going on. Even the details of it, like the show changes Tyrion's fake offer to Varys to offering Myrcella to the Greyjoys. That's what he says he's going to do in the show, and that makes more sense actually than what he tells Varys in the books, which is that he's going to send Tommen to Dorne to be betrothed to Arianne. It's never mentioned what exactly Tyrion is pretending he's going to do with Tommen, and it should be something clever because he's trying to fool Varys. It makes more sense that Varys would, as he does in the show, kind of see through Tyrion entirely and say, "You're not actually sending Myrcella," and Varys is like, "Actually, yeah, that's true. I'm not doing this." It's more consistent, and I think it's stronger writing. Or you have something I'd completely forgotten about because it's so memorable in the show when you have the scene where Tywin informs Tyrion he's going to marry Sansa. And like Cersei is just like dripping with anticipation. And then Tyrion is like shocked and horrified. Like, "Joffrey made this girl's life a living hell since he chopped off her father's head. Now she's free of him. You give her to me? That's cruel, even for you." And in the books, he like doesn't even react. He's just like, "Oh, you're gonna marry me to Sansa." Yeah, makes sense. It's just it's just not, there's just nothing there. And you don't get that reversal with Cersei where then she gets brought low by Tywin turning the hammer on her and saying, "You got to marry." It's just the dynamic isn't there. I think my favorite example is from Tyrion's trial, where you have that amazing delivery from Dinklage when he says, I wish I was the monster you think I am." So great. And in the books, it's, "You make me sorry that I am not the monster you would have me be, but there it is." It's just clunkier. It's just too many words to get this idea across. And I think for me, that's one of the highlights of Game of Thrones as an adaptation is those early seasons with Tyrion and how snappy those dialogue scenes are. For me, that's some of the stuff in the show I rewatch most often.
I think you're right about that. I think I find Tyrion's season 2 material particularly strong. I think the trial thing, like the way you said it too, is really good too. There's really good voice acting on your part. I think is the way that Tyrion does it. "I wish I was the monster you think I am." Like, it's really visceral the way he does it, and it was like all set up really well, right, to be this the Tyrion that we come to find in A Dance with Dragons, who's really kind of broken and torn up about things that he left Westeros on. So you asked why like things ended up turning out the way they did, and I think part of the reason in the show why Tyrion starts to decline as a character starting in season 5 is something that David Benioff said, and he did say this in the context of Tyrion and Daenerys meeting in season 5, where he says, creatively it made sense for us because we wanted it to happen. There, that is, Dany and Tyrion are two of the best characters of the show. To have them come so close together this season, then have them not meet felt incredibly frustrating. Also, we're on a relatively fast pace. We don't want to do a 10-year adaptation of the books. We don't want to do it a 9-year adaptation of the books. We're not going to spend 4 seasons in Marine. It's just time for these two to get together. It's hard to come up with a more eloquent explanation, but that just felt right. Varys puts Tyrion's mission out there in the season premiere, and the mission ends in Marine. So that was the rationale to speed Tyrion's journey to Daenerys in the show. And, it's understandable in one sense. The show knew that they were working to a 7 or 8 seasons max at a time when Benioff said this. Turns out it was 8 seasons. But at the same time, there were real losses in hustling the narrative to the point where Dany and Tyrion intersect. And we start to see some of those losses when we compare what we saw in seasons 5 to 8 with what George ended up doing with Tyrion in A Dance with Dragons and his early Winds of Winter sample chapters. They, in my opinion, I think we talked about this in one of our Patreon episodes about the whitewashed episode, about how seemingly they fell in love with Peter Dinklage's performances and how amazing he was at doing dialogue, and loved the snarky, funny side of Tyrion. But there was another dark side of Tyrion that also wasn't featured in the show, and there's more than just simply the dark side that wasn't featured in the show.
Yeah, I think obviously we've talked plenty of times about the change in Tyrion's adaptation and the kind of shifting away from the darkness in A Dance with Dragons. But I think it's specifically important to talk about it in terms of dialogue. I think that's really where you see it maybe more than ever. That those great crackling scenes start to disappear when he leaves Westeros in season 5, and it just nosedives for me with like the drink and nose things improv sessions in season 6. Because, yeah, I mean, I get why you don't want to spend 4 seasons in Marine, but ultimately it's not about how long you spend in a place, it's what you do with it. And I think they had missed opportunities with Tyrion there. And I think the core of the problem, I think, is that in A Dance with Dragons, George did something that I think is brilliant. And he dismantled the appeal of Tyrion's crackling dialogue by having him use it as just a blunt instrument. Like it's not witty anymore, it's just cruel. It's a weapon against the world that has rejected him. And for a variety of reasons, as we've covered before, the show was never going to go there with Tyrion. And so when it came to those dialogue scenes, all they could do is fall back on a pale imitation of the earlier seasons. It's not just that they weren't working from the book anymore. It's that it just felt like a regression in terms of tone. So I think you could argue that they got the construction of Tyrion's character early on even better than George did, that in some ways they improved. But what they neglected was the deconstruction, the heel turn, where George pulls back the curtain and says, hey, this is how Tyrion's actually going to use those things you found enjoyable about him. And so I think that's part of what held Dinklage's Tyrion back, is that the audience never got to see him use that same skill set for darker purposes. Because, we talk about Tyrion as a big break for him going into dance, and that's true. But as we've been saying in this chapter and previous chapters with Tyrion in book 1, the seeds are there all along for this darker turn for Tyrion. It's that the mix of the change and the continuity that makes that great. And that's a hard balance to strike. For me, that's what the books end up doing better than the show in regards to Tyrion's character.
I agree. I think when we're looking at what Tyrion ends up in seasons 5 and beyond, I think you're absolutely right to focus on that they got the construction really well, better than George. But then the deconstruction, George just knocked it out of the park, and they didn't do it. They kept Tyrion essentially at the same construction level throughout. I think that's something that will forever kind of haunt the show. I think ultimately, I think we saw a lot of consequences to the fact that they did not show Tyrion becoming dark and just using his wits and his dialogue for like bitter, angry ways and ways of and destructive ways. I think, when you look at A Dance with Dragons, there's a lot of funny moments in Tyrion's dialogue in A Dance with Dragons, a lot of funny things that he does, but they're like kind of the same. They're kind of like cruelly funny, I think is the best way to put it. They're not like simply constructive, so to speak. So I do think that the fact that we have spent so many years with Tyrion, both in the show and now in the books, we're spending even longer with him, waiting for him to come around. I am going to be very curious to see how the deconstruction continues. And, as we talked about in previous episodes, Patreon otherwise, I am curious to see whether there will be a point in Tyrion's storyline where he not redeems himself, but he realizes the path he's gone on has been not for good, and then he ends up redeeming himself in some way or bringing himself back up to speed, perhaps becoming Hand of the King to redeem himself for all of Westeros for all time. Who knows? But I think that would be a good way that George could do it. I think we saw some version of the show having Tyrion be the Hand of the King at the end of the series, but without having the necessary build-up background to make it really compelling as a narrative endpoint.
I think regardless of whether or not Tyrion is redeemed at the end, because that's really a subjective thing, as we see with the endless fights about Jaime in that regard, and more that I want his endgame to be connected to his actions. So my problem with Tyrion at the end of season 8 was it was just too many domino falls away from anything he'd done. Mm-hmm. You know, it was just about Dany, and Tyrion felt so ancillary to that. And I think in the books, as we've said before, he's going to be more directly connected to what happens in King's Landing. And I think there's going to be a real reckoning for that will integrate the whole of Tyrion's character and establish that, yeah, the man in the Game of Thrones is the man in the Clash of Kings is the man in A Dance with Dragons. That's one character. And I think that is what I hope to see at the end of Tyrion Lannister's characterization in the books.
Absolutely. So I think that about wraps us up for Clash of Kings Tyrion 1. Thank you everyone for listening. And for those of you who are watching, thank you for continuing to watch. For those of you who are watching, we are not going to sign off immediately after this episode. We will stick around and bullshit with you guys for a little while. So I hope you guys stick around with us too. As always, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, anywhere and everywhere you find your podcasts.
Absolutely. Check us out at Patreon if you haven't already at patreon.com/NotACast ASOIAF, especially as we get into Fever Dream going forward. Follow us on Twitter at NotACast ASOIAF or shoot us an email at NotACastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can follow me at Poor Quentin on Twitter.
And you can follow me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsofIceandfire.wordpress.com. So join us next week as we head north to Winterfell, where Bran Stark is trying really, really hard to be a good prince, but he can't ignore the wolf howl in his head, telling him that he's something else entirely in A Clash of Kings, Bran 1.
Heck yes. I was saying the last time we did a Bran episode at the end of A Game of Thrones, his arc in A Clash of Kings, even if it's not like as exciting or as propulsive as like Tyrion's chapters, it's just perfect narrative architecture, just craftsmanship. Like Bran has this perfect arc, the struggle of identities in his head, so well established in his first chapter, and then you get to the end of the book and you find him reconciling the two and moving on, and it's just great. There's so many great themes and minor characters to establish. I just really love Bran's Clash chapters, and I think they're one of the more underrated parts of the series on the whole. So be making that case in more next week.
Absolutely. So again, thanks for listening. Thank you guys who are watching us, and we will see you guys next week on the regular cast, next month for our next live stream cast. All right. We go ahead and stop the...
I've stopped recording.
Audacity. Yep.
Beautiful.
And now we can just like sit back and bullshit with everyone who's still in the chat.
Right. How we doing, guys? What did we think?
Yeah. How we do? Amazing. 100%. A+.
Did I make fun of Jeff not nearly enough?
You sang. I'm still upset at that you sang.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Rob Swells asked this question. I don't know the answer to this. What was Tyrion's living situation prior to the start of the series? Was he living in King's Landing or Casterly Rock?
I want to say King's Landing because he makes mention of like hanging out with Robert Baratheon, really enjoying hanging out with Robert Baratheon.
Right. He liked Robert, great blustering oaf that he was. I think Tyrion says at one point, yeah, that's true. That makes sense. But it just as a random hanger-on, it's just like a court flunky, I guess. We don't really get a sense of him doing anything.
Well, I think it's interesting too. Like you would think that he would know who like Captain Vylar was, the one who's the captain of the guards, but he doesn't seem to have any existing relationship with him before he meets up with him to tour the city. And I don't know. He could have been at Castle Rock too. I mean, it's interesting. I'd be curious. Like
maybe he was just like wandering, with his dad's money. Maybe that's like how Tywin would prefer him. I don't think we ever get any concrete stuff about this, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
No, I think like it would be cool if he spent some time at Old Town or something like that. It's interesting. I think like we know more about like Oberyn Martell's like backstory and all his travels than we do about Tyrion Lannister, because they're like Oberyn tells about how he was in the Old Town. It was at Old Town. He visited Tyrion at Casterly Rock when he was a baby. He's been all over the place. He was in Essos for a little while trying to raise armies for trying to raise Dorne, and then he would end up in Essos as a sellsword. So it's interesting that would be we know less about Tyrion's backstory than we do about Oberyn Martell.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I guess, it's part of you have all these other characters, all these other POVs like within established family structures, and Tyrion is deliberately like the outsider. So it kind of makes sense that he would just be kind of peripatetic and wandering around. And it wasn't involved with anything directly.
Rob does make the good point that he was at some point running the drains at Castle Rock, so he must have slid at some level at Castle Rock too.
Right. That was when he wanted to do like the traditional like going abroad tour that like his uncles had done, and Tywin said, "Fuck that, you're going to stay here." So I get the sense that was like just after Tyrion reached adulthood, which is like 8-9 years.
Yeah, it could be
before the start of the series. So yeah, I could see that being the case. It's not like Sandor, whereas like Sandor had to go to King's Landing just because otherwise Quaker was going to kill him.
Right.
You don't get that sense Tyrion was ever felt that way about Tywin necessarily. So who knows?
Yeah, who knows? They're talking about Tyrion being Mario, apparently from Super Mario Brothers. I don't know why.
Why do we let you people talk?
Yeah, we need to mute.
Why do we invite
everyone gets muted?
I was going to propose this to you now. Let's see what the chat thinks as well. What do you think about doing another combination episode with Jon's first couple chapters? Because I was looking ahead, and Jon 2, it's nothing happens.
Just like hanging out.
They get to White Tree, that little village north of the Wall, and they introduce Dolorous Ed, and like that's it. So I think that might be another case for a combination episode.
What about let me look up the wiki, because there's like Jon
1 is there at Castle Black. That's when you get like the Donal Noy True Steel metaphor. And yeah, Jon 2 is when they first go beyond the Wall.
I'd be down for it, but let's see what the people say, because we're all about the people, right?
Sure.
We're not.
It seems generally pro. Eliana's comparing it to a combination Pizza Hut and Taco Bell, which I believe is a positive thing. Yes?
Yes, good.
Eliana, tell us what you think about Pizza Hut and Taco Bell.
You mean the local pizza place, Pizza Hut?
Sure, exactly. Keith J asks, how do you guys plan on handling the chapters that add up the Battle of Blackwater? That's an interesting question. Davos has just the one chapter, so presumably we'll be doing that individually. But I could see us combining maybe a couple of the other ones. We'll see.
I mean, like they just kind of flow, like Tyrion, Sansa, Davos. So it's like what goes Tyrion, Sansa, Davos, Tyrion, Sansa, Tyrion, Sansa.
You only get the one on the Baratheon side. So yeah, that's another potential case for combinations. Like, if looking ahead, the Red Wedding, we might combine a couple. Purple Wedding, you get those like really short chapters that come one after each other in the same place. Those are always good moves.
Frank B asks when Steve Atwell is coming back on again. Should we tell the people when that's happening?
Sure, we're planning on bringing him back for a couple episodes coming up. Actually, we're hoping to have him on next for Catelyn's first chapter with Robb at River Run making his peace deal. And then if he's available, we'd love to have him on for Bran's second chapter, which is the one where everyone comes to Winterfell with like their various, political gamesmanships to do. That's something he's written really, really effectively about. And again, I think is an underrated aspect of the series. And it's especially important to come back to it with King Bran in mind. Coming back to those early Bran chapters where he's working on his leadership skills, super important. So assuming he's available, we'll have him for both. Atwell's the best in the game. He just came out with his big old essay on A Storm of Swords, Davos 4, which is one of the best chapters in the series, where Stannis names Davos' hand, and just nailed it. So if somehow you managed to miss Atwell's work, now is the time to check it out. And of course, go listen to 2 episodes we've done with him so far on Eddard 11 and Catelyn 11 in A Game of Thrones.
They were a lot of fun to do. I think like it's funny, like Atwell is like super smart, right? And he's very like academic,
intimidatingly smart.
It's really intimidating for both of us. I mean, because for those of you guys who, and you guys probably all know this, but I mean, for those of you who don't, like, Emmett and I both like grew up, so to speak, in the fandom, reading the Steve Atwell's chapter by chapter. I remember when he finished A Clash of Kings, for instance, like 2013, 2014. Mm-hmm. So like he was like a very early inspiration. Stefan Sass is the same way. Like they both were very inspiring. And I know that you've gotten to chat with Stefan Sass about different stuff in the fandom, different been on Blonde, which is really, really cool. But yeah, he's a super chill dude. He's very smart, but he's very intimidating too at the same time. I'm always like sweating, like I'm going to like get some sort of like detail about the politics wrong. And then be like, actually, I'm like, oh God, please still my heart like falls apart and I fall apart.
And he's just got, he's got the historian's thing of like, oh, I have half a dozen comparisons for this point that I can make. It's just like, well, I've never heard of any of those things. But, I mean, to be, he's not pretentious. He's not he's not smug or anything. He's a very down to earth dude. He's a lot of fun. So we can't wait to have him on for more things.
Absolutely.
Nelson asks, what chapters are we most excited for? Looking ahead at the Clash of Kings. I mean, House of the Undying is an obvious choice. That's gonna kick ass. That might be more towards my end of the spectrum in terms of what I think we're both gonna bring our A game on is the Storm's End chapters, the Catelyn and Davos chapters there. Those are incredible for me. That's like the real heart of the Clash of Kings right there. What else?
Yeah, Catelyn 3, Davos 2. I think Davos 1 I'm really excited for as well on Dragonstone.
Frank just brought that up, of course, because that's
why would Frank bring that up? Why would Frank bring that chapter up? Right?
No reason at ever. It's not like he's for it. Maybe it's good
if he's good enough. Yeah, I think like Brand 2 I'm really excited for too because I am. You had mentioned it at the end of the episode itself, but I'm really excited for the reevaluation of Bran Stark and hopefully the rehabilitation of Bran Stark. The other thing is
King
because
Bran,
he deserves it.
King Bran is awesome. I understand people quibbling with other parts of that endgame, but I have zero patience for people complaining about King Bran.
Yeah,
Bran's a good boy, and he's going to be the king, and y'all just have to deal.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun. Theon chapters, like I think I've read in my own I've read I think through chapter 15 of A Clash of Kings, just straight through before we started coming on for the main episodes themselves. Like Theon 1 is really strong. I mean, it's super long, but it's really a strong chapter. And like Baelish Greyjoy is such a terrible, pretentious fucking asshole. Like it's so good. Like it's a really
single dumbest politician and strategist in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. Theon's chapters are brilliant from a character perspective. Maybe George's best, especially put Flash and Dance together. The plot stuff is a little shakier, as we'll get into. Stuff like Sir Roderick just leaving Winterfell, just completely open to Theon, and like no one escaping Ramsay's battle to reveal what he did. There's like
until a Dance with Dragons when he needs.
Until a Dance with Dragons when it's convenient. Like if you break down the details of Theon's class chapters, they're kind of shaky, but his arc is absolutely perfect, right from the get-go with Theon 1. So we're gonna have an amazing time with those. Micah asked what we thought of their theory on Hyle Hunt, which you haven't read. It's the idea that Hyle Hunt will challenge Jaime to a duel in Brienne's place in the hopes of impressing Brienne and getting to marry her and all the stuff he's kind of hinting at wanting to do in her Feast for Crows chapters. And I love that theory. Hyle Hunt was never exactly one of my favorite characters, especially compared to the rest of Brienne's supporting cast. But that theory I thought perfectly snapped into place. Okay, yeah, that's why he's there. That could be what his purpose is, and that could be why he seems like a lesser version of Jaime almost. So yeah, I like that theory a lot, and Micah did a terrific job executing it. So you should definitely all go track that down on Reddit if you have not already.
It's a lot of fun. Plus, people have said that I'm Hyle Hunt apparently in terms of like my actual. So we have to. So we have to have.
That's not wrong.
Wait, it's not wrong. Wait a minute. I'm Jaime.
Yo, sure you are, buddy. Does that make me Septon Maribald? Because I'll take it.
That makes you Cersei.
Ooh, yeah, I'll take that too. Not bad at all.
Oh man. Oh.
What else? What else we got from exactly? Chloe sums it up. You want to be Jaime, and I want to be Mance, but I know I'm Edmure at heart. I want to be the rogue badass, bringing everyone together, but I'm actually just sitting on top of a wall, trying my best, messing everything up.
Wait a minute. Now they're saying I'm Victarion. You're Cersei.
Victarion, guys. Jeff is smarter than Victarion. Come on.
Yeah,
Jeff's persona is a Victarion. That's not the thing. Give him a little more credit. Let him be Tormund at least.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, Tormund.
Tormund rules.
Lannister Guardsman number 3 who stabbed Ned. Thanks. Great.
That's fair. Fantastic. That's fair.
Someone says, Guilty Undertaker says, if Bran wasn't a child, his warging Hodor would put him in competition with Euron for the worst person. Do you agree with that?
I don't know if I'd say it puts him in competition with Euron. Euron has a record that I think outlasts pretty much everybody at this point. But yeah, Bran possessing Hodor is the darkest part of his story. And I know Bran being a kid is only a partially mitigating factor, because by the time you get to Dance, Bran is perfectly aware that Hodor does not want him there. And Bran is no longer doing it just to save them in the moment. Like the first time Bran possesses Hodor, I get it, because Hodor is potentially betraying them with his noise to the wildlings. But by the time you get to the cave and Bran is doing it just to explore and just to feel strong, and he's thinking about, what if I comfort Mira when Hodor's body? I'm like, ugh, God. Like that's the worrying aspect of Bran's arc, and that's something that, I mean, obviously we kind of know where that's going thanks to the show, but Yeah, on par with Euron. I'm not quite there. I think for me, it's more on par with the darker aspects of Dany's character than anything like Euron. Euron is more in like the Varamir Six Skins, like so monstrous you're barely a person anymore category.
I agree with that. I think like Bran's age is a big factor, and it's like his. I do wonder if this will be like the big bad thing that he does is skin change Hodor, and that's ultimately what's going to. I think at some level he's going to realize what he's doing, and then he'll snap back from that. Maybe it'll be Hodor's death that'll snap him back from that, which would be sad. But will you guys stop comparing me to like different fucking characters in this series? I'm not. I'm me ultimately.
Aw, sweetie. You got Benjen. That's pretty good.
I got Ned Stark from our Justiciar on the Trident, which I'm down with that. Except for I'd prefer to leave this part of me intact. Together.
Eliana brought up the Blackfish. How original. maybe you're him after all. Who knew?
Ooh. Who's Emmett? That's what I want to know.
Yeah. What do you got? Who am I?
Who am I?
Tell me. Rob asks if the village hero has to be is the village in question is Pennytree, and yeah, almost certain.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's gonna be interesting. I think like
ooh, Marwyn. This is So Refined says I'm Marwyn. Fuck yeah, I'll take the hell out of that.
Yeah, you would. Yeah, you would. You guys are literally your names. Wait, so that means you're Quentin. No.
Or am I Iron Emmett? Is that what they mean?
Iron Emmett, you're definitely Iron Emmett.
Yeah, he's more of a badass than me. Matt says Emmett is a warlock getting wrecked on Shade of the Evening. Yeah, the Undying might actually be the most accurate. That's college Emmett for sure. It's permanent apartment in the House of the Undying.
Pre is what Frank says.
Oh God, thanks Frank. Brutal. What else? What else we got? We're looking forward to Bran's chapters, like I said. Then we got Catelyn's chapters. Catelyn's chapters, I think, maybe are the best in Clash. If I take a POV, they're just flawless. And then we'll get to Dany's. Dany's is by far the weak link, I think, as we'll get into. Yeah, but overall, I'm looking forward to everything in Clash. We didn't even bring up one of the great chapters in Clash, is the Catelyn Jaime one.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, Catelyn.
That's just
7.
Her very last chapter with Jaime. That might be that's one of the best dialogue scenes in the series. But I'm thinking of the great ones, like that one, Stannis versus Renly at Storm's End, Ned versus Cersei in the Godswood. Those are all some of the best. Yeah, Jake asks how stoked I am to get to the House of the Undying. Can't even tell. Yeah, that's just a wild chapter.
Yes, it is very wild. That might. I can already see right now that one being potentially 2 parts. The way the prologue was, just the amount of information that's conveyed there, like
the amount, and just structurally, I'm thinking, how are we going to even do that episode? It's like the foreshadowing groundwork section is just the whole episode,
right? That's
all it is.
The plot of The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring is the foreshadowing groundwork for Dany 4 from a Clash of Kings. It was interesting. Like I just don't understand like how. We talked about this. We were talking about this in the episode about how Tyrion's material in seasons 2 to 4 were better than A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords. I think it's pretty similar, in my opinion. Of season 2 is better for Dany by only like a little bit than A Clash of Kings. I mean, mine is the House of the Undying. Maybe that's like the biggest thing is like the House of the Undying anchors everyone in terms of their expectations and their love for Dany's arc. And yeah, it was kind of a letdown in the show, but I think like the stuff leading up to her going to the House of the Undying was better in the show than it was in the books. Because the books, like, why does it even go to the House of the Undying in the books? I don't even remember. I don't think it's like any important.
There's no reason. She just goes because, well, I've gone everywhere else. I guess I'll go to the House of the Undying today. At least the show makes her go.
Right.
Like, where are my dragons? Is kind of an embarrassing like delivery, but at least there is a plot relevant point that gets Dany into the House of the Undying. And right. the show is live action. You can't do the House of the Undying as it's presented in the book in live action. It's just impossible. And yeah, I do like that there's a little more urgency there. I do like that weird like David Lynch garden party that they have in Karth. That's a fun scene. I still think, yeah, you run into the problem of like Dany's character arc just kind of stops in both season 2 and book 2. And for me, Dany's pretty much the same person at the beginning and end of A Clash of Kings, and pretty much the same person at the beginning and end of season 2, and just all her other arcs she's just transforming and changing so much and changing the world around her. And the end of Clash of Kings, she just leaves Karth because guess it's time to go. Guess we'll go down to the port and find a boat. Like Quaithe says, you must leave the city soon, Daenerys Targaryen, or you will never be allowed to leave it at all. And that's just not true. No one tries to stop her. Like the only person that tries to stop her are the warlocks who send the assassin, and that's only because she went to the House of the Undying, which no one made her do.
Right.
There's just no urgency or momentum or arc going on. Like Karth is incredible for the imagery, and not just in the House of the Undying, all across Karth. Beautiful, beautiful images, but that's pretty much it.
So Maddie brings up that Carthage is Kart Hadesh in Phoenician, so Carthage is supposed to be the.
Maddie always knowing the stuff.
Maddie's knowing the shit.
Like Atwell, it was just bringing the information.
Right.
Yeah, I could see that. That makes. I mean, for me, especially being less historian and more kind of just like into more geeky stuff, Karth feels less like a real place and more like, I don't know, like Atlantis or something. Yeah, it feels like a lost civilization, or like it's an articulation of that kind of trope, even as it draws on real world history. Like for me, like Slaver's Bay and the allusions to Roman history feel a little more grounded than Karth, but that could just be me.
Yeah. Guilty Undertaker says Karth is the side quest you could ignore. The House of the Undying could have been anywhere, which is true. I mean, you could have set the House of the Undying at, the Red Temple of Atlantis or something like that, or
just in the desert. Like it could be like Dany eats a weird cactus in the Red Waste and has her. I mean, because that's the overall structure of Dany's like Clash of Kings arc, right? It's this like prophetic. You go into the desert and have just power brought unto you and your visions and etc. But there's not like there's the sense of it being harrowing as it is like when Jesus goes into the desert.
Right.
So that's what George is going for. Maybe it could have. Maybe I would have enjoyed it more if it was just in the Red Waste. Or the real way, I mentioned this once, that the way I love what I would have loved Karth, what made Karth work for me is if it was literally a mirage. Like Dany leaves Karth, and then in Storm of Swords, she's telling Missandei about, I went to the city Karth, and Missandei just looks at her and goes, that's not a real place. There's no such place Karth. And she goes, what? Obviously, that would throw the world building all to hell. Right. But that for me would like justify Karth for me. But we're spoiling all our wonderful,
all of our Dany thoughts
make when we get to Dany's chapters down the line. Kyle brings up the great point that Shade of the Evening needed to be set up for Euron, and Karth does feel like some Euron setup, even like to the character Urathon Nightwalker, who's mentioned there, who probably is Euron, as we'll get into.
Yes, and I mean, I guess so. I just really hope that Dany doesn't go to Karth, because there's been some theories out there that Dany will go to Karth in the Windsweater. I'm just like,
please let that not be the reason George is struggling so hard to finish the book. Please.
Right.
Let her go. She's already got a bunch of other cities to burn down, and like Volantis is 1,000 times more interesting than Karth. So let her just focus on that.
Do you guys think that Euron is the Corsair King? So context is Micah. Our what is he on the Small Council? I'm drawing a blank. I'm terrible at names.
Lord of the Waves, Warden of the West, Kraken's Bane.
Bam, got it.
I remember because it's awesome. I mean, all of your guys' are awesome, but that one is just particularly like mouthfeel. Anyway,
that's very good. Yeah. So he asks, is Euron? Let me find it again. Is Euron the Corsair King? Right. That's mentioned in Storm of Swords in one of Dany's chapters that came and attempted to purchase the Unsullied from Astapor. I think he's mentioned Dany too, I want to say.
Mm-hmm. Maybe. I mean, this is where we get into whether Euron really has magical wind powers or not. Because if that's him, then he hustled his ass back to the Iron Islands in order to take over for Balon. Because timeline-wise, from the timelines I've seen, it's not that long afterwards that Balon dies. Not enough time for Euron to reasonably cross half the planet. So maybe, but, a lot of pirates in this world. It doesn't necessarily have to be him. And, like, also, what was Euron going to do? I guess he was just going to take over the Iron Islands with a bunch of Unsullied. I mean, he doesn't really seem he doesn't seem to be trying to muscle his way into the Ironborn takeover. He does it politically. So I could see the case for it, but I'm not as sold as I am with Urathon Nightwalker, because that name just screams Euron, with Erethan as the guy who killed everyone like the last King's Moot, and Nightwalker fitting how Euron might be involved with glass candles and shows up in people's dreams. So I'm a hardcore on that one. If it's like a sliding scale of who Euron is, Erethan Nightwalker at the top, Corsair King in the middle, Dario at the bottom. Let's just put it that way.
That's interesting. So I have to ask, like, when do you think that George decided? Do you think so I think we both have the idea that Euron was not going to be an end game or like supervillain when George was originally writing a Game of Thrones, right? So when do you think the decision was made to make Euron that super major villain? Obviously, Euron gets his first canonical mention in Theon's first or second chapter in A Clash of Kings.
And Clash of Kings, when Theon's showing up and he's like, I can take on all these old guys, Balin and Uncle Victarion and Euron. I'm really glad Euron's not here because I don't think I can handle that. It's like the one chink in Theon's like smug armor at that point. But yeah, it's a good question. For me personally, because I'm really convinced that Euron's kind of big contribution to the plot is going to be bringing down the wall. I think he's the one that does that in the books. And so if that's true, I think Euron came about when George started asking himself, okay, how am I bringing down the wall? And maybe he had a bunch of different options in mind and possibilities to do with that. But my guess is Euron was built as a character around that idea. That's my guess.
I think I agree with that. I think like George's like, yeah, the wall's going to come down. I will figure out how to do that later on. Then he like just says like, oh, wait, so I've got this like the Ironborn that I'm introducing in A Clash of Kings, also potentially the Blackfires as well. So you have all of these kind of end state players that are going to have a larger impact on the plot later on that he starts bringing to Clash. I think that's where we're necessarily going. Samir, he asks, and I already answered this, Euron Nightwalker, more or less metal than Euron Crow's-Eye Greyjoy?
Oh, I mean, they're both pretty great. I guess, yeah, Erethan Nightwalker, just because all the syllables are awesome. But yeah, Crow's Eye is a great nickname. And as we will get into, we'll probably touch on in our Forsaken episode when we do that, and as we'll get into more in A Feast for Crows, I think Crow's Eye is one of the strongest clues to Bloodraven's involvement in Euron's backstory, because Bloodraven, of course, is associated with dark wings and dark words and eyes, and those are just his symbols, and Euron appears to have inherited them more or less.
All right. I think we'll take maybe 5 more minutes or so, and then we'll probably...
Yeah, sure. We got anything else? Got anything else for us, folks? Good people?
Someone, Neil B says, George told Elio to not include much about Karth and Summerhall in the World of Ice and Fire because of spoilers.
Huh. Okay, so that could mean we potentially do deal with Karth.
No.
Ugh, fine.
No.
Maybe it's just she goes there to kill Zero's Iron Daxos. I don't know. Whatever.
Just put him on the fucking fleet.
Right.
Just put him on the fleet.
I agree completely. We shall see. Summerhall is also a weird case. I feel like we kind of already know what happened at Summerhall for the most part. Like, there's probably a big reveal in terms of like Egg's complicity and what exactly the lines he was willing to cross. But like we've seen enough of what the Targaryens get up to that I think we can mostly put the pieces together with Summerhall. So I'm actually not hugely I think Summerhall is a powerful, tragic event, but I'm not like at the edge of my seats. Yeah, it's to find out what happened there, because I think we have 95% of
it. Micah asks, why is Edmure the best actual lord in Westeros? Oh, wait, Matt also says he knows what happened at Summerhall.
Oh, does he now? Well,
going back to Karth, everything's coming up Quaith. Sabir says,
coming up Millhouse. Why is Edmure the actual best lord? Yeah, I mean, Edmure has that great line, "My people, they were afraid," when it comes to protecting a small folk. But Edmure also does the battle of the forwards, and regardless whether who you blame, Edmure or Ravra, that turns out Edmure's motivations in fighting that battle are pretty petty and self-serving. So I love Edmure dearly. Would I call him the best lord? Yeah, I mean, he's got that duty to his people that puts him above most. I really like Wyman Manderley, though. I think he generally handles his power very well, so I'd put him high on that list too.
I think Wyman's pretty sweet. Edmure, though, is the best. Yeah, Stannis, of course. We have to mention Stannis. But he's not a lord. He's the king, right? So that's why he can't be the best.
Right. He was. Who knows how much good he did as a lord? Well, Stannis's record is mixed.
Stannis' record is missed.
Mixed, quite a bit mixed. He's got some good and some bad on his little ledger there, as we'll get into.
Maddie says she drove past a Wyman, Iowa the other day, and Ragged Michael, War of the North. I remember that one because I love that name. That's probably like we all have personal favorites, right? Not that we love all of our small counselors equally, but we have like favorites in terms of names. But Ragged Michael, War of the North is just a really good one. He says Rob should have told Edbeard and ordered him to stay out of his cups. That's fair.
Yeah, I mean that's a fight. We're
definitely gonna have that fight.
I think the overall plot points to Rob being wrong, but the character dynamics never really jive for me in that regard, because I don't understand why Rob and the Blackfish are then just gaslighting Edmure out of nowhere. Like, they're not even blaming him in public as a scapegoat; they're just being mean, and it's like that's really not consistent with either of their characters. So we'll get into it, but I feel like the problem there might be that George didn't exactly bring the plot and characters together flawlessly.
Yeah, I agreed there. All right. Well, I think that about wraps us up. If you guys are cool with that, I think it's about 10:45 on correct Freedom Standard Time, which is the East Coast time here. We appreciate the opportunity to interact with you guys. It's a lot of fun, and it's all to you guys, really, honestly, getting us again to our patron level of reaching $5,000 a month. Our next patron level, so again, is not a dollar amount; it's actually a patron level amount, which is 1,000 patrons. It'd be nice to get into that 4-digit figure. So we appreciate you guys. Spread the word as always, and we'll get to do the Forsaken and some other cool stuff down the road as well. So I'm excited. It's excited to do these things. Now we've actually got the technology. I mean, Emmett was working on the technology side for like hours. He spent most of his day trying to figure out the technology side.
We traded it off. You eventually pulled it off, and I'm on vacation right now, so it's all good. I'm just glad we got to do it.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for listening, as always, supporting us. And we will see you guys. We won't see you guys next week. You'll hear from us next week, and we will see you guys in a month from now. We'll let you know when the next live stream will come out. We'll let our Slack patrons know first, of course.
Exactly.
All right, guys. Take care.